I have started writing this 100 times, and 100 times I have stopped, because I know how it sounds. I know what you are going to think of me. But I am an old man now, and I am tired of carrying this alone. For 5 years I worked the deep rainforest of Olympic National Park. I loved that place. The silence of it, the way the moss hung from the trees like something out of a dream. I thought I knew those woods better than I knew my own hands. Then came one night in September of 2012. One sound from the dark, and everything I believed about the forest, about what is real and what is not, came apart in my hands. I never told the truth in my report. I never told my family. I left the wilderness, and I never went back. I am telling you now because you deserve to know what is out there, because I was not the only one who saw it, and because someday the shadows might come for you too. But before I take you into those woods, let me ask you one small thing. If you are sitting comfortable right now, with the lights low and the world quiet around you, do me a favor. Tap that like button and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you want to hear more stories like the one I am about to tell. And I am curious about something. Down in the comments, tell me where you are listening from tonight. What town, what country, what corner of the world. I want to know how far these stories travel in the dark. Maybe you are alone in a quiet house. Maybe you are driving an empty road. Maybe you are lying awake because sleep will not come. Wherever you are, tell me. I read every single one. All right, that is enough waiting. So lock your doors, turn down your lights, and keep one close, because you may need it. This is exactly what happened to me that night. My name is James Walker. This is a true story of events that happened to me in September of 2012 when I was a ranger in Olympic National Park. I've been hesitant to share this account for years, but now, as I approach the twilight of my life, I feel compelled to put these experiences to paper. Perhaps it will serve as a warning, or maybe just a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I had been a ranger in Olympic National Park for a little over 5 years when it happened. The job was a perfect fit for me. I loved the rainforests, the remoteness, the feeling that I'd stepped into another world entirely. But there's remote, and then there's the deep Ho rainforest. Miles of old-growth trees dripping with moss, thick underbrush that seems to swallow sound itself. The kind of place where sunlight barely filters through and getting lost is terrifyingly easy. In early September of 2012, I was assigned to trail maintenance in one of the most secluded areas of the park. It was a routine 2-day job meant to be tackled alone. Routine, at least by ranger standards. My first day on the job went about as smoothly as cutting back vines and overgrowth can get. By evening, I'd set up camp in a small clearing near the river, cooked myself a freeze-dried dinner, and settled down with my headlamp and a paperback to unwind before bed. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a bear, not a cougar, not the usual symphony of forest critters settling in for the night. It was something like a sob, choked and desperate, followed by a scuffling sound in the undergrowth. Now, protocol is clear when it comes to civilians in trouble. That's when you intervene. But rangers out in the backcountry? You tread lightly, respect the wilderness for what it is. Still, there was something about that sound that set my teeth on edge. I grabbed my rifle, clicked off the safety, and headed in the direction of the noise. The ferns and fallen leaves muffled my footsteps, making the forest seem even quieter after the strange cry. Every creaking branch had me on edge. Up ahead, something thrashed in a thicket of thorny vines. "Hello? Anyone there?" I called out, my voice hoarse in the quiet. No answer came, just an odd rustling sound followed by a flash of movement deeper in the darkness. I took a cautious step forward, my finger resting lightly on the trigger of my rifle. Before we go any further into these woods, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe. It tells me you want more stories like this one. Now hold your breath, because this is the moment everything changed. And that's when the thing pounced. It knocked me clean off my feet, a blur of sinewy limbs and foul-smelling fur. I hit the wet ground with a grunt, my rifle skidding away into the underbrush. I got a glimpse of clawed hands too long for a bear, and rows of teeth, pointed and yellow. But all I really remember are the eyes, big, amber, and burning with a hate that felt, well, not just animal. It let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged for my throat. I rolled away, fumbling desperately in the damp leaves for my rifle. I found it, twisted as much as I dared with the thing so close, and took a shot, more out of instinct than anything else. The thing recoiled with a howl, a spray of blood marking the tree behind it, but it wasn't down. It circled me, panting heavily, its eyes locked on me like prey. That's when I saw it clearly. Too skinny to be a bear, yet strong enough to have taken a grown man down. Skin stretched over prominent ribs, patchy in places, and mottled a sickly brown. The head was almost dog-like, but elongated and filled with far too many teeth. It stalked me like a predator, but there was more there, an intelligence that set my teeth on edge. I fired again. It flinched, then scrambled further into the undergrowth, vanishing in seconds amidst the shadows of the trees. Shaking, I got to my feet, my heart pounding like a war drum. I had to get out of there. Radioing in to report the incident was met with predictable skepticism. It took 3 days, a team of rangers armed to the teeth, and an awful lot of blood splatter on the forest floor before they believed what I saw out there. They never found the creature. Said it must have been a sick bear or maybe a coyote with mange playing mind games with me. I transferred shortly after that, took a desk job up in Seattle. I haven't even liked going on hikes lately, the trees closing in too tight. But every now and then at night, when the city noise subsides, I swear I hear that screech again, and then I see those eyes glowing in the darkness just beyond my window. It's been over a decade since that night in Olympic National Park, but the memory hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown sharper, more insistent. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as the product of fear and isolation. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I'm not the only one with a story like this. Over the years, I've heard whispers, fragments of similar encounters from other rangers, hikers, and backwoods folk. They don't talk about it openly. Who would believe them? But in quiet corners of bars, around dying campfires, the stories come out. There was Elias Harper, a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. His story reached me through the grapevine, passed along by a mutual friend who knew we'd both seen something. Elias's encounter happened in October of 2016, 4 years after mine. The details were different, but the core of it, the otherworldly menace, the primal fear, that was the same. Elias told it like this: I'm a national park ranger working in the Great Smoky Mountains. Love the views up here, but man, these woods go on forever, and half the time you can't see 10 feet through the fog. Perfect recipe for folks getting themselves lost. Got the call about a missing hiker around dusk. Young guy, early 20s, on a solo trip. Last checked in at a ranger station further into the backcountry and never made it to his planned campsite. Cell service out here is spotty at best, so it wasn't uncommon for people to go off-grid for stretches. But a storm was brewing, and rangers don't take chances. I suited up, headed out. The trail wound through thick forest, dripping with mist and shadowed by ancient trees. Rain began to fall, a cold, insistent drizzle. Found his discarded pack a few miles in. It was torn open, gear scattered like he dumped it in a panic. I knelt by a shredded energy bar wrapper, frown deepening. Didn't look like a bear attack. Bear scat's easy to spot, and they usually leave most of the inedible stuff undisturbed. What I did find were tracks, big ones, too wide for a human, and the toes were splayed out strangely. A chill unrelated to the rain snaked down my spine. We get mountain lions up here, but something about the size and shape of these prints felt wrong. Followed those tracks deeper into the woods. The rain picked up, washing away any clearer trace, but I knew I was on the right path. Panic gnawed at my gut. If it was a big cat, the weather would flush it out into the open, same as the hiker. We were both in danger, only I had a radio and a rifle. The forest floor sloped downwards, leading towards a shadowy ravine. As I got closer, the smell hit me. Blood and wet fur mixing with that same rotten chemical stink that had been haunting my nightmares ever since. Well, that's a whole other mess. But trust me, once you smell that, you don't ever forget it. The ravine snaked through the trees, and I moved silently along the high ground, tracking whatever had made those prints. Then ahead of me, movement, a flicker of something pale and unnaturally large hunkering beneath a jutting rock. I crouched lower, heart pounding against my ribs. That's when I saw it, truly saw it. Not a mountain lion. This thing, it was humanoid, but only vaguely. Too tall, too lean, its skin hanging loose on a knobby frame. Its head was like a misshapen skull with yellow eyes that burned like embers in the gathering gloom. Claws, long as a man's fingers, dug into the carcass of what used to be the missing hiker. I fought back bile, raised my rifle with trembling hands. I was a decent shot, but this was beyond any training they give you at the academy. Had to make this first one count. Lined up the sights, took a deep, steadying breath. Then the damn flashlight flickered. Must have gotten knocked loose when I dropped my pack back at the campsite. The beam of light swung wildly, illuminating the creature for a horrifying second. It shrieked, a sound like metal scraping against stone, and reared back, shielding its eyes. It dropped the remains of the hiker and lunged toward me, moving with a speed that defied its skeletal frame. I fired once, twice, the rifle bucking hard against my shoulder. It flinched, roared, but it kept coming. I only had time to scramble back a few steps before it was on me. A force like a runaway truck slammed into my chest, sending me sprawling backward. I hit the earth hard, rifle flying from my grasp. The creature loomed above me, its fetid breath washing over my face. I fumbled for my backup pistol, fingers clumsy with fear and cold. It raised a clawed hand to strike. Somehow I managed to roll, the blow narrowly missing my skull but tearing open my shoulder. I scrambled back, scrabbling desperately for a weapon, anything. The creature snarled, stalking forward. Pain seared through me, and my vision blurred around the edges. This was it. This was how it ended. A sudden beam of intense light cut through the forest gloom so bright it made me flinch. The creature jerked back, hissing, the light stinging its eyes. Confused but desperate, I swung my own flashlight around. Another beam joined mine from further down the slope, accompanied by a familiar voice yelling my name. Reinforcements, finally. The creature, caught between our flashlights, whirled in a frenzy of snapping claws and gnashing teeth. Its skin began to smoke where the light touched it, a sickening smell filling the air. And then, with a final howl of rage, it turned and vanished into the undergrowth, the sounds of its retreat muffled by the pounding rain and the roaring pulse in my ears. My fellow rangers, Edie and Walker, found me slumped against a tree, bleeding and gasping for breath. Their faces were a mix of relief and horror when they saw the claw marks raking my shoulder. Edie patched me up as best she could, while Walker swept the area. Found my rifle further down the ravine, but no sign of the creature. It took two of them to haul me back down the trail to the main road. They kept throwing nervous glances over their shoulders, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every rustle of branches, every echoing hoot of an owl made us jumpy. It wasn't until the flashing lights of the ambulance came into view that I began to relax the death grip I had on my pistol. At the hospital, they stitched me up, ran every test imaginable, and then came the questions. Park Service, local cops, they all wanted details. I stumbled through a description of the creature, doing my best to stick to the facts, avoid sounding like a lunatic seeing monsters. They exchanged uneasy looks. I could read it in their eyes. They didn't fully believe me. Word must have leaked because soon enough the reporters descended. Questions about the missing hiker, the animal attack. I stuck to my line. Injuries attributed to falling during the rescue mission. Can't have the whole world thinking there's some unholy beast roaming our national parks. They bought the story, at least officially. The aftermath was a blur. Weeks of physical therapy for my torn-up shoulder. Nightmares that jolted me awake, sweating and gasping. I went back to work eventually, but everything had changed. Every hike, every patrol, I scanned the trees, not for lost hikers, but for those glowing yellow eyes and the stench of decay. And there were rumors, whispers among the other rangers. A sighting of a strange, emaciated figure near a campsite, a string of shredded tents blamed on wild animal activity, or that whisper about the lone hiker who went missing deep in the backcountry, leaving behind only a single monstrous footprint in the mud. Nobody ever connected the dots officially, of course. One night I was on a late patrol when I encountered Edie at a crossroads deep in the park. She didn't say a word, just passed me a thermos of strong coffee and a sealed envelope. Didn't need to ask what was inside. Silver bullets, hand-loaded, not standard issue for park rangers, that's for sure. She met my gaze, the unspoken understanding clear in her eyes. "After what you saw," she said, her voice low, "figured you could use these. Be careful out here, Elias." The knowledge that I wasn't alone in this, that helped, some nights at least. But there was also a growing certainty. This wasn't over. That creature was still out there. Call it a wendigo, a demon, whatever those old stories named it. The fact remains, there's something preying on the lost and alone in these mountains. One day maybe I'd track it down, put an end to its reign of terror, but that felt like a fool's hope. See, the thing about fighting monsters is, they fight back. And sometimes they win. One foggy morning, a shredded backpack turns up, or a hiker vanishes on a familiar trail, and I'm left wondering if it got another one. Meanwhile, my own life's on hold, got a half-healed scar, a beat-up old truck, and a growing collection of high-powered flashlights. No wife, no kids, can't drag anyone into this mess. Sometimes I think about leaving the mountains, try getting lost in a big city crowd for a while, see if I could just disappear. But then I remember the faces of the missing, the way that young hikers' torn-up gear was strewn across the trail, the look in Edie's eyes when she handed me those bullets, and something stubborn and stupid inside me digs in, so I stay. Keep my gear ready, rifle cleaned, and an extra flashlight within reach at all times. Every time I drive along the park roads, every time I head into the woods, the weight of responsibility settles heavy on my shoulders. Feels less like a job now, and more like a war. A war most folks don't even know is happening. And out there, under the old trees and shrouded in the mountain fog, it waits. The creature with the glowing eyes and the unending hunger waits for the next lost hiker, the next overconfident camper, the next ranger who stumbles upon its shadowed domain. Some nights, lying awake in my cabin with the rain rattling the roof and the wind sounding like a mournful howl, I wonder who it will be waiting for when I inevitably fail, when my flashlight flickers, or my aim misjudges, or it finally catches me unaware. And who, if anyone, will take up the fight when I'm gone. Maybe someday this story will get told after it's too late for me. Maybe some younger ranger, green and brave and foolish like I used to be, will find this account. If that's you, whoever you are, well, good luck, kid. You'll need it. Because trust me, the monsters are real. The battle will never end. And if the shadows in the woods seem a little deeper, those glowing eyes in the distance a little brighter, the rustle of leaves a little closer, well, best keep your wits sharp and your flashlight ready. You might just be the next line of defense against the things unseen. As I, James Walker, sit here in my Seattle apartment looking out at the city lights that never quite banish the darkness, I can't help but feel a connection to Elias and all the others who face the unknown in the wilderness. Our stories may differ in the details, but the core truth remains the same. There are things out there, things beyond our understanding, and they're hungry. I've often wondered if I should have stayed, should have fought like Elias did. But fear got the better of me. I ran from the forests, from the responsibility. Yet even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I can't escape the memory of those eyes, that unholy scree. I've often wondered if I should have stayed, should have fought like Elias did. But fear got the better of me. I ran from the forests, from the responsibility. Yet even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I can't escape the memory of those eyes, that unholy screech. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself reaching for a flashlight, peering out into the city shadows. Because deep down, I know the truth that Elias and others like him face every day. The monsters are real, and they're not confined to the wilderness. They're out there, waiting, watching. And whether we choose to face them or not, their hunger never ceases. So to anyone who reads this, remember, stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and always, always keep a light nearby. The battle against the unseen may never end, but as long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, there's hope. It was the middle of winter, early January 2023. The holiday decorations had barely been packed away when my cousin suggested we take advantage of the long weekend. I was 28 then, desperately needing an escape from my mind-numbing office job. This time of year, right after Christmas, our region typically receives substantial snowfall, perfect for a secluded getaway. Elliot called me on a Tuesday evening. "Hey, I've been talking with Grant. Uncle Philip said we could use his cabin for the weekend. What do you think? Thursday to Saturday, just the three of us." The proposition was tempting. 3 days away from deadlines and fluorescent lighting sounded like paradise. Uncle Philip's cabin was nestled in the Sawyer Mountains, about 3 hours from town. remote enough to feel disconnected, but not so isolated that we'd be completely cut off from civilization. "Did Uncle Philip mention anything else about the cabin?" I asked, remembering vague stories from family gatherings. Elliot hesitated. "Well, he did say something about his kid seeing things. Apparently their 6-year-old was standing at the kitchen window last summer and started pointing outside. When Aunt Donna asked what he was looking at, the boy said there was a woman standing in the yard. Aunt Donna checked, but nobody was there." "That's it? A kid with an imaginary friend?" I laughed, relieved it wasn't something more unsettling. "Pretty much. Oh, and there's a winter storm coming, but nothing serious. We all have 4-wheel drives, and we know how to handle snow. Worst case, we get stuck with extra hot chocolate and board games." I agreed, without much hesitation. The three of us had been close since childhood, Elliot with his perpetual optimism, Grant with his practical sensibility, and me somewhere in between. If anyone could make a weekend in a potentially haunted cabin enjoyable, it was us. We spent the next day gathering supplies, food to last 3 days, sleeping bags in case the heating was unreliable, firewood, portable chargers, and a medical kit, Grant's insistence. The meteorologist on the evening news mentioned potential heavy snowfall in the mountains, but nothing that concerned us. We'd driven through worse conditions before. What I didn't realize then was how thoroughly we'd underestimated both the weather and the cabin itself. Had I known what waited for us in those mountains, I would have fabricated any excuse to stay home. But ignorance propelled us forward, 3 cousins seeking relaxation, unaware that we were driving straight into a nightmare that would forever change us. Thursday afternoon arrived with overcast skies and a steady drop in temperature. We loaded our respective trucks, mine a weathered Ford, Elliot's a relatively new Chevy, and Grant's rugged Dodge, and began our journey at precisely 2:15 p.m. The plan was to reach the cabin before dark, get settled, and enjoy a warm dinner by the fireplace. The first 2 hours of driving were uneventful. We traveled in a convoy, maintaining visual contact through our rearview mirrors. The radio forecasted increasing snowfall for the mountains, but nothing that set off alarm bells. As we turned onto the unmarked gravel road leading to the property, light flurries began dusting our windshields. "This is nothing," I reassured myself, watching the wipers clear thin layers of white powder. Just enough to make it feel like a proper winter retreat. The cabin appeared gradually through the trees, a large, 2-story structure built primarily of dark timber and stone. It was considerably more imposing than I'd imagined from Uncle Philip's descriptions. The roof sloped steeply to prevent snow accumulation, and the windows were smaller than modern designs, giving it an older, more ominous appearance than I'd expected. We parked in a semicircle facing the cabin's entrance, the snow now falling steadily around us. The temperature display on my dashboard read 28 degrees. "Home sweet home for the next couple days," Elliot called out as we grabbed our bags. His breath formed dense clouds in the frigid air. The cabin key was hidden under a hollow rock by the front steps, exactly where Uncle Philip said it would be. The door opened with a protesting creak, revealing a surprisingly spacious interior. The main floor consisted of an open living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with dated appliances, and a dining space with a heavy wooden table. A staircase led to the second floor, where I presumed the bedrooms were located. "It's cold as hell in here," Grant muttered, dropping his bags near the entrance. "Let's get a fire going before we unload everything else." The fireplace was substantial, clearly the main source of heat for the cabin. While Grant inspected it, Elliot and I explored the rest of the space. The kitchen cabinets contained basic cooking utensils, mismatched plates, and a few pantry staples. A landline telephone sat on a small table in the corner, our only communication with the outside world, as cell service was non-existent this far into the mountains. Upstairs we found 3 bedrooms, 2 with queen beds and 1 with twin beds, plus a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and no shower. The walls were decorated with faded photographs of landscapes and ancient hunting trophies that stared down with glass eyes that seemed to follow our movements. "I call the room that doesn't have dead animals watching me sleep," I announced, claiming the smallest bedroom with the twins. By the time we finished unpacking, Grant had a robust fire crackling in the fireplace. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily, accumulating on the ground at a concerning rate. The wind had picked up as well, whistling through tiny gaps in the cabin's structure. "I think we beat the storm by just a couple hours," Grant said, looking out the window. "Another hour on the road and we might have had trouble getting here." We settled in for the evening, preparing a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce. The cabin grew warmer, more inviting as night fell completely. We sat around the fire with beers in hand, exchanging stories and laughing, three cousins enjoying the isolation and each other's company. None of us mentioned the child story about the woman outside the window. None of us wanted to invite that thought into our consciousness as darkness enveloped the cabin and the sounds of the forest became increasingly audible through the howling wind. It was nearly midnight when we decided to turn in. The storm outside had intensified, battering the windows with snow and creating drifts against the cabin walls. The wind produced strange sounds, moans and whispers that I attributed to air passing through the trees and the cabin's old timber frame. As I climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to my chin, I noticed how the moonlight filtered through the snow-crusted window created unusual patterns on the wall. Shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I closed my eyes tight, forcing myself to attribute it to fatigue and the effects of the beer. I fell asleep listening to the storm's fury, unaware that it was the last peaceful night's sleep I would have for a very long time. I awoke to the unmistakable aroma of breakfast cooking, bacon sizzling, eggs frying, the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee. The smell was so vivid, so enticing, that it pulled me from the depths of sleep instantly. Sunlight streamed through the window. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white landscape. The bedside clock read 7:23 a.m. Unusual for either Elliot or Grant to be awake this early on vacation, but the smell suggested someone was preparing a feast. My stomach growled in anticipation as I pulled on a sweater and shuffled toward the kitchen. In the hallway, I encountered Elliot, his hair disheveled from sleep, eyes half-lidded. "Man, whoever's cooking deserves a medal," he yawned, rubbing his eyes. "I'm absolutely starving." Together, we descended the stairs, following the mouth-watering aroma that grew stronger with each step. The kitchen doorway framed a scene bathed in morning light, countertops gleaming, the old stove standing sentinel against the wall, a kettle on the countertop, but no food, no pans on the stove, no plates set out, and no Grant. "What the hell?" Elliot muttered, looking around in confusion. "You smell that, right?" "I'm not hallucinating." I nodded slowly, approaching the stove and placing my hand near the surface. Cold, completely cold, as though it hadn't been used in days. The coffee maker sat unplugged in the corner, the kettle empty and cool to the touch. Yet the smell persisted. Bacon, eggs, sausage, coffee, so real I could almost taste it. "Morning," Grant's voice startled us both. He stood in the doorway, fully dressed. "You guys smell it too, huh?" We nodded in unison. "Been like this since I woke up 20 minutes ago," Grant continued, moving to examine the stove himself. "At first I thought one of you was cooking, but nobody's cooking anything," I finished, feeling a distinct uneasiness settle in my stomach. "So where's the smell coming from?" We searched the kitchen thoroughly, checking cabinets, looking behind appliances, even inspecting the ventilation, finding nothing that could explain the phantom breakfast scents that still hung heavily in the air. Uncle Philip didn't mention anything about ghost cooking, did he? Elliot attempted to joke, but his voice lacked conviction. "Let's just make some actual breakfast," Grant suggested pragmatically. "Maybe we're all just hungry and imagining things." But as I gathered eggs and bacon from our cooler, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that we weren't alone in the cabin. The aroma had begun to fade, but occasionally intensified without warning, as though someone invisible was moving pans around a hot stove right beside us. We ate in relative silence, occasionally glancing toward the empty stove that still seemed to be the source of phantom cooking smells. Outside, the snow glistened under a clear sky, at least 8 inches deep based on the drift against the porch railing. "We should check on the trucks," Grant said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Make sure they're good to go in case this weather turns again. Forecast said there might be another system moving in tomorrow." The suggestion seemed reasonable, practical even, But as we bundled up to step outside, I couldn't help feeling we were all looking for an excuse to leave the kitchen and its inexplicable sensory anomaly behind. None of us mentioned that the cabin's young visitor had only reported seeing a woman outside, not experiencing phantom smells. None of us wanted to consider what that might mean, that perhaps the cabin had more than one story to tell. The day had transformed into a postcard-perfect winter scene. Sunlight reflected brilliantly off the snow, and the trees stood heavily laden with white. Under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. Instead, every shadow among the trees seemed to harbor watchful eyes, and the pristine stillness felt artificial. Too perfect. Too quiet. We trudged through knee-deep snow to our vehicles, our boots leaving deep impressions in the untouched white surface. The temperature had risen slightly, but remained well below freezing. "Let's start them up and let them run for a bit," Grant suggested, pulling keys from his pocket. "Battery drain happens fast in this cold." I nodded in agreement, reaching my truck first. The door opened with resistance, snow falling from the frame as I climbed inside. The interior was freezing, the leather seat stiff beneath me. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it confidently. The engine made a weak rattling sound, then nothing, just a hollow click. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. Same result. A pathetic attempt to turn over, then silence. Through my frosted window, I could see Elliot and Grant experiencing similar issues. Elliot stood beside his open driver's door, repeatedly turning his key while Grant had his hood up, staring at his engine with visible frustration. I exited my truck and approached them. "Battery issues?" "It's not the battery," Grant said firmly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "At least not in mine. Everything's connected properly, and these are all relatively new vehicles. All three wouldn't have battery failure simultaneously." "Could it be the cold?" Elliot suggested. Grant shook his head. "We've driven in colder conditions. Something's not right." We spent the next hour checking engines, connections, and fluids. All three trucks appeared to be in perfect working order, yet none would start. It made no mechanical sense. "Let's call for help," I suggested, remembering the landline inside. "Maybe Uncle Philip knows someone nearby with jumper cables or a tow truck." Back inside, I lifted the phone receiver and pressed it to my ear. No dial tone, just empty, hollow silence. "Phone's dead," I announced to the others who had followed me in. "Must be the storm knocked out the lines." "Perfect," Elliot sighed, dropping onto the sofa. "So we're stuck here until someone realizes we didn't come home tomorrow?" "People know where we are," Grant reasoned. "If we don't show up by Sunday, someone will come looking." The implication settled over us like a heavy blanket. 2 more nights in this cabin, with no transportation and no communication. Under ordinary circumstances, it might have been merely inconvenient. We had enough supplies, shelter, and heat. But after the morning's inexplicable occurrence, the prospect felt distinctly more threatening. "We need more firewood," Grant said after a long silence. "I'll check the woodshed out back. You two see if there's any alternative communication here, a radio, anything." I watched through the window as Grant made his way to a small structure about 50 yards behind the cabin. The woodshed was barely visible through the trees, its dark shape contrasting with the surrounding snow. Grant's figure grew smaller as he trudged through the deep snow, eventually disappearing among the trees. Elliot and I searched the cabin for anything that might help our situation, finding nothing but old magazines, board games with missing pieces, and dusty books on shelves. The isolation that had seemed appealing just yesterday now felt oppressive. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Grant should have returned by now. "I'm going to check on him," I told Elliot, reaching for my coat. Just as I was pulling on my boots, the front door burst open. Grant stood there, his face ashen, eyes wide with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Pure, undiluted fear. "There's someone else here," he gasped, slamming the door behind him and leaning against it. "I swear to God, I'm not making this up." "What happened?" I demanded, helping Grant to the sofa. His hands were trembling violently, and his breathing came in rapid, shallow bursts. "I was loading firewood," he began, his voice unsteady. "I had my arms full, ready to head back. Then I heard someone laugh, a woman's laugh, soft, almost playful, like she was amused by something. Elliot and I exchanged glances. Maybe it was just the wind, Elliot suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. Grant shook his head emphatically. No, it was a laugh. Clear as day. I turned around and... He swallowed hard. There was a woman standing about 20 feet away at the edge of the trees. She was wearing what looked like a white nightgown. Her hair was long, dark brown. She was just watching me. Did she say anything? I asked, trying to keep my voice level despite the cold fear spreading through my chest. No. She smiled at me, then turned and walked behind the woodshed. I dropped the wood and ran after her. I thought maybe she lived nearby, could help us with the trucks or phone, but when I got around the shed, there was no one there. And the thing is, his voice dropped to a whisper. There were no footprints. None. Just untouched snow everywhere. The silence that followed was deafening, each of us processing what this meant. We need to check, Elliot said finally, standing up. All of us, together. Nobody argued. We bundled up and ventured outside, staying close to one another as we approached the woodshed. The snow around it was disturbed only by Grant's footprints, deep indentations leading from the cabin to the shed and back, with a chaotic pattern where he had apparently dropped the wood and given chase. But there were no other prints, no sign that anyone else had been there. I swear she was here, Grant insisted, his voice cracking. Right there, by those trees. I approached the spot he indicated. The snow was pristine, unmarked by human passage. The surrounding forest stood silent, indifferent to our confusion and growing fear. I believe you saw something, I said carefully. But whoever it was, they didn't leave tracks. So what are you saying? Grant demanded. That I hallucinated? That I'm losing my mind? No, Elliot interjected. We all smelled breakfast this morning when nobody was cooking. Something strange is happening here, I just don't know what. We gathered the scattered firewood in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The woods around us seemed to press closer, the silence more absolute than natural. Even the birds had gone quiet. Back inside, we built up the fire and huddled around it, seeking comfort in its warmth and light. Nobody wanted to voice the obvious connection to Uncle Philip's story. A woman seen outside where no woman should be. Let's think this through logically, I suggested, desperate to impose some rationality on our situation. 3 vehicles don't just stop working simultaneously without cause. Maybe there's something environmental affecting them, some kind of electromagnetic interference or something. That doesn't explain the woman, Grant muttered. Or the cooking smells, Elliot added. We spent the remainder of the day in a state of heightened awareness, jumping at every creak of the cabin's timbers, every whistle of wind through the eaves. We played cards, attempting to distract ourselves, but our conversation was stilted, our minds elsewhere. As darkness fell, the atmosphere in the cabin grew even more oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker. We kept the fire blazing, pushing back against the night. None of us wanted to acknowledge the dread that had settled over us, the certainty that whatever had begun, it wasn't finished with us yet. We should take shifts sleeping tonight, Grant suggested as the clock approached midnight. One person stays awake at all times. No one argued. We drew straws to determine the order. Elliot would take first watch, then me, then Grant. The arrangement provided little comfort, but it was better than nothing. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I paused at the window overlooking the backyard and the woodshed. For just a moment, I thought I saw a pale figure standing at the tree line, a flash of white against the darkness. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there but shadows and snow. I told myself it was just my imagination, overwrought from the day's events. But as I settled into bed, listening to the house creak and moan around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, studied, by eyes that belonged to something that wasn't quite human anymore. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by strange dreams and the persistent feeling of being observed. In my dreams, I wandered through the cabin, following the scent of cooking food, only to find a woman in white standing at the stove, her back to me. When she turned, her face was a void, a blank emptiness where features should have been. I woke with a strangled gasp at 2:17 a.m. according to the bedside clock. My shift to keep watch would begin at 2:30. 13 minutes to compose myself, to shake off the lingering tendrils of the nightmare. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop and crackle from the fireplace downstairs. I pulled on my sweater and made my way carefully down the darkened hallway, trying to avoid the floorboards that had creaked under our weight earlier. Elliot sat rigid in an armchair facing the front windows, a battery-powered lantern casting a small circle of light around him. He didn't acknowledge my approach until I was directly beside him. "Hey," I whispered, touching his shoulder. He flinched violently. "Sorry," he mumbled, running a hand over his face. "Must have zoned out." "Anything happened during your watch?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing concrete, just noises, probably the wind." "What kind of noises?" "Scratching. At the windows. And I keep thinking I hear someone walking upstairs, but then I remember you and Grant are up there, so—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. "Well, I'm here now. Get some sleep." Elliot nodded gratefully and retreated upstairs. I took his place in the armchair, adjusting the lantern to cast light on both the front door and the kitchen doorway. The fire had died down to glowing embers, providing minimal heat and even less light. The silence was absolute. No wind, no creaking timber, no nocturnal animals. Just stillness so complete it felt unnatural, as though the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only this cabin suspended in void. At 3:08 a.m. the scratching began. At first, it was so faint I thought I'd imagined it, a light, almost tentative sound at the window to my right. Tiny noises like fingernails dragging gently across glass. I sat perfectly still, straining to locate the source. The scratching moved, from the right window to the left, then to the front door. Methodical, deliberate, as though something was testing each entry point. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and frail in the darkness. "Is someone there?" The scratching stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expectant, charged with potential energy. Then came the footsteps from the kitchen, soft, measured steps on the wooden floor. The distinct sound of a heel, then toe, heel, then toe. The gait of a woman walking slowly, unhurried. I raised the lantern, pointing its beam toward the kitchen doorway. Empty. Yet the footsteps continued, now moving across the kitchen toward the living room. Toward me. My throat constricted with terror. I wanted to call out for Elliot and Grant, but no sound would come. I was frozen, watching the empty doorway as the footsteps drew nearer. They stopped just at the threshold of the living room, at the exact point where the lantern light met darkness. "Who's there?" I finally managed, my voice cracking. A whisper came in response. So quiet I almost missed it. "I'm cold." The lantern flickered, dimmed, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness I heard the footsteps resume, now moving directly toward my chair. I scrambled backward, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. Pain shot through my elbow, but adrenaline overwhelmed it. I crawled frantically toward where I knew the fireplace to be, hoping to find a poker, a log, anything to defend myself. My hand closed around the metal handle of the fire poker just as I felt something cold brush against my cheek, like fingers made of ice trailing along my skin. I lashed out blindly with the poker, connecting with nothing but air. The touch withdrew. The footsteps receded, moving back toward the kitchen, then up the stairs. Each creak of the steps distinct, deliberate. I fumbled with the lantern, shaking it desperately until it flickered back to life. The living room was empty. I shone the light toward the staircase, nothing visible, yet the footsteps continued their ascent. They stopped outside the bedrooms upstairs. "Grant! Elliot!" I shouted, finding my voice at last. "Wake up!" Doors flew open upstairs. Heavy footsteps, real, solid footsteps, pounded across the hall as my cousins responded to my call. "What's happening?" Grant demanded, appearing at the top of the stairs, Elliot right behind him. "There's someone in the house," I gasped, still clutching the poker. "I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, right to where you're standing." They looked at each other, then back at me, their expressions a mixture of concern and fear. "There's no one here," Elliot said gently, descending the stairs. "We would have seen them." "I heard it," I insisted, "and before that, scratching at the windows, and—" I hesitated, not wanting to sound completely unhinged. I heard a voice. It said, "I'm cold." Grant joined us in the living room, his face grim. "I believe you. After what I saw today, I believe you." We rebuilt the fire together, none of us willing to be alone. The remainder of the night passed in tense silence, all pretense of sleep shifts abandoned. We sat vigil until dawn, jumping at every sound, watching the windows and doors for any sign of intrusion. When morning finally came, we were exhausted, strung out, and no closer to understanding what was happening in this isolated cabin in the mountains. The phantom breakfast smells returned with the morning light. Stronger now, almost overwhelming. None of us mentioned it as we moved mechanically through our morning routines, brewing actual coffee and preparing a simple meal of the few provisions we had left. "We need to try the vehicles again," Grant said between bites of dry cereal. "If they still won't start, we should consider walking out. The nearest town can't be more than 10 miles. 10 miles through snow this deep?" Elliot shook his head. "That's a last resort. Someone will come looking for us by tomorrow if we don't show up back home today." "Unless they can't get their vehicles to start either," I pointed out grimly. "Whatever's affecting our trucks could be more widespread." We fell silent, considering the implications. The strange occurrences in the cabin were terrifying, but at least we had shelter, heat, and some food. Venturing into the wilderness in winter conditions carried its own deadly risks. "Let's check the trucks first," Grant decided. "Then we'll make a plan." Outside, the day was clear again, the sun reflecting blindingly off the snow. We approached our vehicles with little hope, but went through the motions anyway, turning keys in ignitions, checking connections, tapping on gauges. As expected, none of the engines would turn over. "This makes no sense," Grant muttered, slamming his truck's hood down in frustration. "There's nothing mechanically wrong with any of them." We were heading back to the cabin when Elliot suddenly stopped, pointing toward the tree line beyond the woodshed. "Look there. Is that a structure?" I squinted against the glare of sun on snow. Something dark was visible through the trees, the corner of what might be another building, perhaps a quarter-mile away. "I don't remember seeing that yesterday," I said slowly. "We were focused on the woodshed," Grant reasoned. "Might have missed it. Could be another cabin. Maybe someone who could help us." The decision was unanimous. We would investigate. We marked our path with broken branches stuck upright in the snow, creating a trail we could follow back if visibility decreased. The trek was difficult, the snow reaching mid-thigh and some drifts, but determination pushed us forward. As we drew closer, the structure took shape, not a cabin, but a small, weathered house. Its windows were dark, the paint peeling from its wooden siding. It had clearly been abandoned for some time, yet somehow had escaped the notice of whoever maintained Uncle Philip's property. The front door hung partially open, swollen with moisture and unable to close properly. We approached cautiously, calling out to announce our presence, though we were fairly certain no one would answer. "Hello? Anyone here? We need some help." Silence greeted us. Grant pushed the door wider, and it groaned in protest as we entered. The interior was a single room, a small rustic dwelling with basic furnishings covered in dust and cobwebs. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, a bed against another. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the center, and shelves lined with preserved foods and supplies covered another wall. "Looks like some kind of caretaker's house," Elliot suggested, examining the space. "Probably abandoned when they built the larger cabin." I moved toward a small desk in the corner, where papers were scattered in disarray. Most were too water-damaged to read, but a few remained legible. Property records, maintenance notes, and personal correspondence dating back to the 1980s. One envelope caught my attention. Yellowed with age, but protected from the worst of the elements by the desk drawer it partially protruded from. I carefully extracted it, finding a newspaper clipping inside, along with a handwritten letter. The clipping, dated January 12, 1982, bore the headline, "Woman Found Frozen Near Mountain Cabin." I read it aloud to the others. The body of Josephine Harlow, 34, was discovered yesterday morning approximately 100 yards from her residence in the Sawyer Mountains. Authorities believe Harlow became disoriented during the severe blizzard that hit the region last weekend. She was found wearing only a nightgown, having apparently left her home without proper attire. Harlow lived alone in the remote location following the death of her husband 3 years prior. Neighbors report she had become increasingly reclusive and erratic in recent months. The county coroner listed cause of death as hypothermia. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me as I turned to the letter. It was addressed to someone named Arthur, dated 1 week before the newspaper article. Arthur, I cannot stay here another night. The solitude was bearable at first, even welcome after John's passing. But something has changed. I hear cooking in an empty kitchen. The vehicles won't start without reason. And most troubling, I've begun to see a figure standing at the edge of the property, a woman in white who vanishes when approached. I fear for my sanity. I've called the property office to terminate my caretaking position. I'll leave as soon as the road's clear. Please check on me if you don't hear from me by the 10th. Josephine. My hands trembled as I finished reading. We stood in stunned silence, the implications sinking in like a stone in deep water. She experienced the same things we are, Grant whispered, 40 years ago. And then she died in the snow, Elliot added, his voice hollow, trying to escape whatever was happening. I reread the letter, a terrible understanding dawning. The woman in white that Josephine saw, what if that's who you saw at the woodshed? What if that's who I heard last night? But Josephine died, Grant said slowly. She was found frozen in her nightgown. The realization hit us simultaneously. The woman in the white nightgown seen by Grant, by Uncle Philip's son, perhaps by countless others over the years, was Josephine herself. We need to get back to the cabin, I said urgently. Pack our things and try the trucks again. If they won't start, we need to stay put and wait for help. What if help doesn't come? Elliot asked, voicing the fear we all shared. Then we stay together, I insisted. No matter what happens, we stay together. We left the caretaker's house with the letter and newspaper clipping, following our marked path back to the cabin. The day was advancing, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. We had perhaps 4 hours of daylight left. None of us spoke of what we'd found, but a shared understanding hung in the air between us. We weren't dealing with imagination or coincidence. Something inexplicable was happening in these mountains, something that had claimed at least one life before, and we were trapped in the middle of it. The remainder of Saturday passed in tense anticipation. We gathered our belongings, packed our vehicles, and prepared for either rescue or another night in the cabin. The strange occurrences continued. Phantom cooking smells wafting through the kitchen, unexplained footsteps on the stairs, the occasional glimpse of something white moving at the periphery of our vision. But understanding the history somehow made it more bearable. The terror remained, but it was tempered by a kind of sad comprehension. Josephine Harlow had died, trying to escape something she couldn't understand. We were determined not to share her fate. We maintained the fire, conserved our remaining food, and kept constant watch on each other and our surroundings. As night fell, we agreed to sleep in shifts again, but this time, no one would be alone. 2 awake, 1 asleep, rotating every 3 hours. The scratching returned at the windows after midnight, more insistent now, almost desperate. The temperature inside the cabin dropped dramatically despite the fire, our breath visible in the air. "I'm cold," came the whisper from the kitchen, audible to all of us this time. So cold. None of us responded. What could we say to a voice from beyond death? To a woman who had died in the snow 4 decades ago, trying to escape the very phenomena she now seemed to perpetuate? The night stretched endlessly, each hour an exercise in endurance. When dawn finally broke on Sunday morning, we were exhausted but alive, and filled with renewed determination to leave this place. "Let's try the trucks one more time," Grant suggested as the first light filtered through the windows. Together. We stepped outside into the bitter morning air. The snow had hardened overnight, a thin crust of ice forming over its surface that crunched beneath our boots. The sky was clear, promising another deceptively beautiful winter day. We approached my truck first, all 3 of us standing beside it as I inserted the key into the ignition. I took a deep breath, offered a silent prayer to whatever might be listening, and turned the key. The engine roared to life immediately, as though it had never had a problem. We stared at each other in disbelief, then rushed to the other vehicles. Each started perfectly, engines purring in the cold morning air. "I don't understand," Elliot said, shaking his head. "Why now? What changed?" I thought about Josephine's letter, about her plans to leave when the roads cleared. Maybe she just wanted company, someone to understand what happened to her. Or maybe she's warning us, Grant suggested quietly, making sure we don't stay too long, like she did. We didn't linger to theorize further. We closed up the cabin, leaving it exactly as we'd found it, apart from our depleted firewood and food supplies. No one suggested returning for Uncle Philip's key. We left it on the kitchen table, eager to put distance between ourselves and this place. As I was about to climb into my truck, I turned for one last look at the cabin. A movement caught my eye, a figure in the kitchen window watching us, a woman with long brown hair wearing what appeared to be a white nightgown. She raised her hand slowly, palm pressed against the glass. I didn't tell the others. Some things are better left unshared. Instead, I raised my own hand in a mirroring gesture, an acknowledgement, a farewell. Our convoy pulled away from the cabin, tires crunching on hardened snow. No one spoke on the drive back to town, each of us processing what we'd experienced in our own way. We parted with brief, awkward hugs and promises to call later. But we never really talked about it again, not in any meaningful way. What was there to say that wouldn't sound insane to anyone who hadn't been there? How could we explain the inexplicable? Uncle Philip called me a month later to say the cabin had been sold to developers. 6 months after that, he mentioned casually that the new owners had demolished it, planning to build a more modern structure in its place. The demolition had been complicated by an unexplained fire that consumed what remained of the old cabin. The caretaker's house was never mentioned. Perhaps the developers never found it, hidden as it was among the trees. I've often wondered what happened to Josephine after the cabin was destroyed. Did the flames release her from whatever bound her to that place? Or does she still wander the property, confused and cold, seeking warmth and companionship in her eternal isolation? I don't know if I'll ever return to the Sawyer Mountains to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered. But on cold January nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I sometimes catch the faint scent of bacon frying, eggs sizzling in a pan. And I wonder if Josephine found her way here, following us home from that isolated cabin in the mountains. I wonder if she's still trying to tell us something we failed to understand. At 19 years old, I thought I knew what fear was. I was wrong. What happened to me and my family during our vacation in the remote wilderness of northern Maine in July 2023 changed everything I believed about the world and the things that lurk in the darkest corners of it. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is what I survived. I was traveling with my family, my mother, a nurse who had worked double shifts for months to afford this trip, my twin siblings Blake and Maya, both 16 and inseparable, and my Uncle Derek, my mother's younger brother, who had been living with us since losing his left arm in a construction accident 2 years prior. The drive to our rental cabin took nearly 8 hours through increasingly desolate back roads. Blake and Maya had fallen asleep in the back seat hours earlier, their heads leaning against opposite windows. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional crackle of static from the radio as we drove deeper into areas where cell towers were sparse. Uncle Derek sat in the passenger seat, his remaining hand drumming nervously against his thigh. He'd been different since the accident. Quieter, more prone to staring into empty space. The doctor said phantom limb syndrome was normal, but I wondered if losing part of yourself changed more than just your body. "How much further?" my mother asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "GPS says 47 minutes, I replied, though the device had been glitching for the past hour, sometimes showing us on roads that didn't exist, sometimes losing our location entirely. The landscape outside grew more forbidding with each mile. Towering pine trees pressed close to the narrow road, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so thick that even in mid-afternoon, we needed headlights. Occasionally, we'd pass a mailbox or a dirt driveway disappearing into the woods, but no houses were visible from the road. "This place better be worth it," Uncle Derek muttered, flexing his remaining fingers. "Middle of nowhere doesn't begin to cover it." The cabin appeared suddenly as we rounded a sharp curve, sitting on a small clearing beside a lake that stretched beyond our vision into the gray distance. The building was older than the rental photos had suggested, weathered cedar siding and a sagging front porch that creaked even in the absence of wind. A hand-painted sign near the driveway read, "Cedar Point Cabin, Esther 1987. Blake and Maya woke as we pulled into the gravel driveway, both rubbing their eyes and looking around with the disorientation of long sleep. "Are we there?" Maya asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Finally," my mother said, turning off the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive after hours of road noise. Even the lake was unnaturally still, its surface like black glass reflecting the overcast sky. Uncle Derek climbed out first, fishing the keys from his pocket with his good hand. The front door was solid wood, painted forest green but chipped and faded. As he struggled with the lock, I noticed deep scratches in the wood around the door frame, not from keys, but something else, something with claws. "Mom, I'm going to take a walk," I said, needing to stretch my legs and escape the oppressive feeling that had settled over me since we'd arrived. "Don't go far," she replied, already helping Blake and Maya gather their bags. "And stay away from the water until we check how deep it is." I nodded and headed toward the tree line behind the cabin. The forest was dense, with undergrowth that hadn't been cleared in years. Fallen logs lay across faint paths, and spiderwebs stretched between branches at head height. The air smelled of decay and damp earth, with an underlying odor I couldn't identify, something organic and unpleasant. 20 yards into the forest, I stopped. The trees here were enormous, some so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them, even with help. But it wasn't their size that made me pause. It was the damage. Deep gouges scored the bark of nearly every tree, starting about 7 feet from the ground and extending upward as far as I could see. They were too wide to be from any animal I knew, and too deep to be from tools. Some of the marks were fresh, with sap still bleeding from the wounds. Others were older, the wood blackened and infected-looking. I approached one of the damaged trees, running my fingers along the gouges. They were smooth, as if something had carved them with surgical precision. The spacing suggested claws, but claws unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each mark was nearly as wide as my thumb, and they were arranged in sets of 4. The feeling started then, a creeping sensation that I was being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the forest around me. Nothing moved except for the gentle sway of branches in a breeze I couldn't feel. But the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. I tried to rationalize it. We were tired from the long drive, and I was naturally anxious in unfamiliar places. The scratches on the trees had logical explanations. Bears, maybe, or some kind of equipment used by loggers. But even as I told myself these things, my heart rate increased, and my palms grew damp with sweat. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, no small animals rustled through the underbrush. The only sound was my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I backed away from the tree and began walking deeper into the forest, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain. The path, if it could be called that, wound between massive tree trunks and over fallen logs slick with moss. The canopy above was so thick that very little light penetrated, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the day. 30 yards from the cabin, I found something that made my blood freeze. A clearing, roughly circular, where nothing grew. The ground was bare earth, packed hard as concrete. In the center lay the remains of what might once have been a deer, but the bones were wrong. Too large, arranged in patterns that defied nature. I should have turned back then. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab my family and leave this place immediately. Instead, I crept closer, drawn by the same terrible curiosity that makes people slow down to stare at car accidents. The bones were white, bleached clean by time and weather, but they weren't scattered randomly as they would be if predators had been at the carcass. They were arranged deliberately, almost ceremonially. The skull sat atop the ribcage, facing the forest. The leg bones formed a perfect square around the remains. Something had done this. Something intelligent. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. As I fell, my hand landed on something soft and wet. I looked down to see a pile of what looked like shed skin, translucent and flexible. It was roughly the size of a garbage bag, but the texture was wrong. Too smooth, too uniform. The watching sensation intensified until it felt like physical pressure against my skull. I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't slow down until I burst from the tree line into the clearing around the cabin. My family was on the porch, unloading the last of our supplies. My mother looked up as I approached, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to tell her about the bones, the shed skin, the feeling of being watched. Instead, I forced a smile and shook my head. "Just tripped over a root. Forest is pretty dense back there." Uncle Derek was struggling to carry a cooler with his one good arm. I helped him get it inside, grateful for the distraction. The cabin's interior was rustic but clean, knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it had been there since the 1980s. "This place has character," my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. Even she seemed to sense something off about our surroundings. That evening, we made dinner on the propane stove and ate by the light of kerosene lamps. The cabin's electricity was unreliable, and the generator was too loud to run after dark. Blake and Maya seemed unaware of the tension that had settled over the rest of us, chattering about their plans for the next day. "Can we go swimming tomorrow?" Maya asked, pressing her face against the window that faced the lake. "We'll see," my mother replied. "Let's get a better look at the water in daylight." As darkness fell, the forest around us came alive with sounds. Not the normal sounds of wildlife, but something else. A rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from all directions at once. Uncle Derek noticed it too, his head tilting as he listened. "Probably just branches rubbing together in the wind," he said, but his voice was uncertain. The scratching continued for hours, sometimes fading to almost nothing, sometimes growing so loud it seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. None of us slept well that first night. I lay in the bottom bunk, Blake had claimed the top, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds outside. Around 2 in the morning, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the noise had been. I must have finally drifted off, because I was awakened by the sound of the front door opening. I checked the clock, 3:17 a.m. Blake was snoring softly in the bunk above me, and Maya was curled up in the single bed across the room. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window. Uncle Derek was walking across the clearing toward the lake, his silhouette barely visible in the starlight. Without thinking, I pulled on my shoes and followed him outside. The night air was much colder than I'd expected, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The scratching sounds had been replaced by a different noise, a low, rhythmic groaning that seemed to come from the direction of the lake. I caught up with Uncle Derek about halfway to the water's edge. He was standing perfectly still, staring out at the lake's surface. Up close, I could see his face was pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Derek?" I whispered. "What are you doing out here?" He turned toward me slowly, as if waking from a dream. I had to come out here. Something was calling me." We stood together by the water for nearly an hour, neither of us speaking. The groaning sounds continued, sometimes seeming to come from the lake itself, sometimes from the forest behind us. Uncle Derek's hand shook as he wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "We should go back inside," I finally said. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. I could feel eyes on us from multiple directions, though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Uncle Derek nodded, but as we turned to head back to the cabin, he suddenly broke into a run. I started to follow, but something slammed into my back with tremendous force, driving me face first into the ground. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs and filled my mouth with dirt and dead leaves. I tried to push myself up, but an enormous weight settled on my back, pinning me down. I could feel whatever was on top of me breathing, slow, deliberate breaths that stirred the hair on the back of my neck. The smell was overwhelming, rotting meat mixed with something chemical and sharp. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard screaming from the direction of the cabin. My family was standing on the porch, their faces illuminated by the yellow glow of the kerosene lamps. Even from this distance, I could see their terror. The weight on my back shifted, and I felt something rough and scaly brush against my neck. Then came the sound, a low rumble that I felt in my bones as much as I heard it. It was like the purring of a giant cat, but wrong in every way that mattered. Hot breath washed over my face as something leaned down close to my ear. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain I was about to die. Instead, I felt a sharp pain across my shoulder blades as claws raked through my shirt and into my skin. Then the weight was gone. I lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, not daring to move. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw a massive shape moving through the trees at the forest's edge. It was too dark to make out details, but I caught glimpses of yellow eyes reflecting the lamplight from the cabin. Uncle Derek reached me first, his face white with shock. Oh God," he kept repeating as he helped me to my feet. "Are you hurt? Can you walk?" I nodded, though my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. Together, we stumbled back to the cabin where my mother was waiting with a first aid kit. The scratches on my back were deep enough to require cleaning and bandaging, but not serious enough for stitches. None of us slept for the rest of that night. We barricaded the doors and windows, pushing furniture against them until the cabin felt like a fortress. Uncle Derek sat by the front window with a kitchen knife, his hand trembling as he watched the tree line. "What was that thing?" Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. She and Blake huddled together on the couch, their faces pale in the lamplight. "I don't know," I replied, and it was the truth. Whatever had attacked me was unlike anything I'd ever seen or heard described. It was too large to be a bear, too intelligent to be a wild animal, and too real to be a figment of my imagination. The scratching sounds returned with the dawn, but now they were accompanied by other noises, thuds against the cabin walls, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, and occasionally a low growling that seemed to come from directly outside whichever window we were nearest. My mother tried to use her cell phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The landline was dead, and the cabin's radio picked up nothing but static. We were completely cut off from the outside world. "We need to leave," Uncle Derek said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Pack everything. We're getting out of here." But when we looked outside, we discovered that leaving wasn't an option. Our car sat in the driveway, but all 4 tires had been slashed, long, deep cuts that went all the way through the rubber. The same claws that had marked the trees had made these cuts. "It doesn't want us to leave," Blake said, voicing what we were all thinking. The attacks continued throughout the day. Sometimes we'd hear scratching at the roof, as if something enormous was walking across the shingles. Other times, shadows would pass by the windows, shapes too large and moving too deliberately to be anything natural. We rationed our food and water, not knowing how long we'd be trapped. The generator fuel was running low, and the kerosene lamps wouldn't last much longer. Soon, we'd be in complete darkness with whatever was outside. On the 3rd day, Uncle Derek made a decision that probably saved our lives. He'd been studying the creature's patterns, timing its movements around the cabin. "It's always on the forest side," he said. "It doesn't go near the lake during daylight." He was right. Whatever was stalking us seemed to avoid the water, staying in the trees where it could remain hidden. If we could make it to the lake, we might be able to work our way around to one of the other cabins we'd seen when we arrived. We waited until midday, when the creature seemed to be least active. Uncle Derek went first, moving quickly but quietly toward the water's edge. One by one we followed, staying low and keeping to the most direct path possible. The lake was shallow near the shore, with a rocky bottom that made walking difficult. But we followed the shoreline for nearly 2 miles, staying in the water where our scent would be harder to track. Behind us, we could hear crashing sounds from the forest, as if something large was moving parallel to our path. The first occupied cabin we reached belonged to an elderly couple from New Jersey. They took one look at our condition and immediately offered help. While the man called the police on his working phone, his wife tended to our cuts and exhaustion. The police arrived within an hour, but by then, whatever had been stalking us was gone. They found our cabin exactly as we'd left it, with all our belongings still inside. The car tires were slashed, just as we'd described, and there were indeed scratch marks on the trees. But they found no other evidence of the creature. No footprints, no hair samples, no clear explanation for what had happened to us. The official report listed the incident as possible bear encounter with property damage. I know what attacked us wasn't a bear. Bears don't arrange bones in patterns, don't slash car tires to prevent escape, and don't stalk families with the calculated intelligence we experienced. But I also know that some things are too far outside normal experience to be believed. We never returned to collect our belongings. 6 months later, I still have nightmares about yellow eyes watching from the forest. The scars on my back serve as a permanent reminder that there are things in this world that science hasn't cataloged, things that hunt in the deep places where humans rarely go. I'm sharing this story not to convince anyone of anything, but as a warning. If you ever find yourself in a remote area and feel like you're being watched, trust that instinct. If you see signs of something unusual, bones arranged in patterns, claw marks too large for any known animal, areas where wildlife seems to avoid, don't investigate. Leave immediately. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left unexplored. The creature in those woods is still out there, and I pray I never encounter it again. This account was written in January 2024, 6 months after the events described. The author's identity has been changed for privacy reasons. The location has been deliberately obscured to prevent others from seeking out the area described. My name is Alex Walker, and I'm 32 years old. I live in a small apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, barely scraping by on my meager salary as a park ranger. I took this job out of desperation a few years ago when I couldn't find any other work. The pay is low and the hours are long, but I do love being out in nature. Hiking and camping are my passions. I've worked as a ranger in state and national parks across the country: Isle Royale in Michigan, Crater Lake in Oregon, the Allegheny Forest in Pennsylvania, the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin. But my current post in the remote wilderness of Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina is by far the most challenging. Strange things have been happening lately. Hikers vanishing without a trace, eerie sounds echoing through the woods at night, and a permeating sense of being watched. The other rangers and I are on high alert, but we're understaffed and ill-equipped to deal with whatever is going on. Last night, I had a terrifying experience. I was alone in my watchtower, gazing out at the moonlit trees, when I saw a shadowy figure darting through the underbrush. It moved impossibly fast, more animal than human. I tried to follow it with my binoculars, but it disappeared into the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine. We'd been getting reports from campers about strange sightings in the woods, ghostly apparitions, dark shapes stalking between the pines, glowing eyes peering out from the shadows. The old-timers in the nearby town spoke of ancient legends, evil spirits that roamed the forest, seeking lost souls to drag into the depths. I'd always dismissed such tales as superstitious folklore, until now. Something is out there in those woods. Something unnatural. I can feel it in my bones. It's my job to keep the park visitors safe. But how can I protect them from an unknown threat? I radioed the central office, requesting backup and search parties to find the missing hikers. But so far my calls have gone unanswered. We're on our own out here. Just me, a few other rangers, and the eerie presence lurking in the wilderness, waiting to strike. I've started keeping a journal to document the strange occurrences, in case something happens to me. If you're reading this now, it means I never made it back out of this forest alive. Please tell my story so others know the truth. There's an evil older than these ancient woods, and it's hungry for human souls. It started with the disappearances. At first, it was just 1 or 2 hikers who failed to return from their backcountry trips. Concerning, but sadly not uncommon, in a rugged wilderness like Nantahala, experienced outdoorsmen can easily fall victim to the elements, getting lost, injuring themselves, falling into ravines. We mounted search parties but found no traces. Then more and more people began to vanish. Whole groups gone without a trace. Abandoned campsites with tents and gear still in place, untouched, like they'd been abducted straight out of their sleeping bags. Panic slowly crept over the park staff. I tried to keep morale up, but I could see the fear in my colleagues' eyes. We all knew something unnatural was happening. I pored over old books and maps in the park archives, searching for any scrap of information. Buried in the dusty pages, I found whispered tales of dark forces in the woods, predating even the Cherokee who once roamed this land. Ancient, malevolent entities that demanded sacrifice and subsisted on human suffering. Was it possible such myths had a kernel of truth? I interviewed some old hunters at the Cedar Log Tavern in the nearest outpost of civilization, 50 miles from the park borders. They spoke of hearing chilling shrieks and howls echoing through the night forest, of finding mutilated deer carcasses dangling in trees, nearly drained of blood. The oldest man leaned across the table, his hoarse whisper barely audible over the honky-tonk music. The hungry ones are back, just like 50 years ago, when campers were found ripped to pieces. That night, I dreamed of twisted, emaciated figures emerging from the mist between the trees, their bodies contorted like gnarled roots, their eyes black pits. I woke in a cold sweat as an inhuman wail pierced the night outside my cabin window. Coyotes, I told myself, but coyotes never sounded so tortured, so hungry. A young couple failed to check in the next morning after camping near Lucifer Falls. Another search, another dead end. Surveying the abandoned tent, I noticed large swaths of fallen pine needles violently kicked up like there had been a ferocious struggle. On a broken fir bough nearby, a single scrap of plaid flannel snagged and fluttering in the breeze. It was stained with something rust-colored that flaked beneath my fingernail. My heart turned to black ice. I'm patrolling the park trails from dawn till dusk now, my senses on high alert, jumping at every snapped twig and bird call. I've started carrying my loaded hunting rifle, even though it's against protocol. The forest seems to close in around me, the shadows between pines deepening even at noon. I know I'm being stalked by an evil that's always just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The darkest day came with the mist. I awoke to find the world outside my cabin window erased, replaced by a thick silver fog that swallowed all sound and light. Uneasily, I made my way to park headquarters to check in with the superintendent and other rangers, but the outpost stood deserted, chairs knocked over, papers scattered, no vehicles in the parking lot, no tracks in the muddy gravel besides my own. Fighting rising panic, I tried the radio. Only harsh static answered. All the Park Service channels, dead air. I was alone in a silent sea of fog and trees, the weight of solitude crushing my chest. With an ominous sense of déjà vu, I recalled my night terrors about shambling, hungry shapes in the mist. The hair on my nape prickled. I spent hours fruitlessly searching for any sign of my co-workers or campers throughout the shrouded forest, calling until my voice went hoarse. Nothing but the echo of my own desperation amid the dripping leaves. Cold dread settled in my marrow with the realization that whatever malevolent force stalked this wilderness had made its move, a full-scale assault. When the mist began to dissipate that evening, I spotted smoke rising above the hills in the direction of a backcountry trail shelter. The distinctive black plume of burning hardwood and evergreen sap. My surge of hope sank to horror as I approached the source. The trail shelter had been reduced to a pile of charred, smoldering timber. It looked like it had been blasted apart from within. Viscous splatters of crimson crisscrossed the splintered logs. Bits of red pulp and shredded fabric littered the leaf mold. The noxious stench of burned flesh mingled with scorched pine sap, making me gag. I didn't have to see bodies to know the gruesome demise met by the shelter's occupants. A faint, gurgling moan made me spin around, reaching for my rifle. There between two pines, a figure crouched over the prone form of a man in a ranger uniform, its spindly hands working in jerky motions. In the dying light, I glimpsed ash-gray skin, skeletal limbs, a head like a grotesque gourd. The thing whipped around to face me, black eyes glittering like beetle shells above a lamprey mouth lined with needle teeth. Blood dripped from its chin. I fired on pure instinct. The bullet punctured the entity's chest with a wet thud, sending it staggering back into the shadows, but it did not fall. To my horror, the dark hole in its emaciated sternum sealed shut like a zipper, edges of fetid gray flesh knitting together. A wheezing rattle issued from its throat, building to an enraged shriek that sent every bird erupting from the treetops in a cacophony of alarm calls. Then it charged me, moving with a jerky marionette gait almost too fast to track. In sheer panic, I turned and ran, sprinting wildly through the trees as the creature's shrieks and loping footfalls echoed behind me. Branches slapped my face and snagged my uniform. My heart felt like it would explode. Ahead through the blue twilight, I spotted a 2-track dirt road, one of the backcountry access routes. An olive-green Park Service Jeep sat parked in the center, driver's door ajar. I threw myself into the vehicle, fumbling the key into the ignition with shaking hands as the shrieks grew closer. The engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror, I glimpsed the entity burst from the tree line onto the road behind me in a flurry of dead leaves, galloping after the vehicle on all fours like a ravenous ape. I slammed the accelerator, tires spitting gravel and pine needles. The thing kept pace for a few yards, its banshee screams ripping the dusk before falling away in the dust. I didn't dare stop until I reached the deserted park headquarters, drenched in icy sweat, gasping. With dread, I realized the horrific truth. One of the ancient hungry ones from folklore had risen from its long sleep, and its ravenous brethren would soon follow. The primal evil that haunted this forest was real, and now it knew I was here, fighting it. There would be no help or backup. Rifle clutched in my shaking hands, I barricaded myself in the HQ to wait out the night, jumping at every creak of timber, while a chorus of distant, unholy howls rose with the moon beyond the pines. I couldn't save the others. The only thing left to do was to try to survive and bear witness, to warn the world of the hungry dark before it could spread, if it wasn't already too late. I barely slept that night, shotgun across my knees, jumping at every creak and groan of the old ranger station. The hungry ones howled in the darkness beyond the walls, an unspeakable hunger in their alien voices. In the gray pre-dawn, I scoured the cabinets and lockers, gathering supplies. Extra ammunition, flare gun, first aid kit, some MREs, anything that might help me survive against the horrors lurking in the forest. With the sun, I emerged into an eerily silent park. No bird song, no chatter of squirrels or chipmunks. Just the crunch of my boots on gravel and the hammering of my heart. At the vehicle depot, I found most of the Jeeps torn open like tin cans, seats shredded, glass and metal strewn across oil-stained concrete. A few drops of blood spattered the ground. I salvaged what I could and sped off in the last working SUV. I drove the winding park roads for hours, searching for any park staff or visitors. But the campgrounds and cabins stood deserted, many ransacked. Backpacks spilling clothes, collapsed and slashed tents, blackened fire pits beside dented cookware. At the Cedar Creek backcountry site, I found only a single hiking boot, the foot still inside, gnawed to a bloody stump at the ankle. Fighting nausea, I realized the hungry ones had free rein over the entire park, and likely had already glutted themselves on dozens of victims. How long had their dark influence spread unchecked while I hid like a coward? In the Jeep's glove box, amid crumpled maps and candy wrappers, I found a leather-bound journal. It belonged to the park's historian, Evelyn. The last entry, dated a week ago, described her research into the area's folklore and a 19th-century fur trapper's account of a wild man that stalked him through these woods, its eyes black as coal and hungry as winter. A guttural cry in the trees shattered my focus. I looked up to see a gaunt figure drop from a pine bough onto the Jeep's hood. A twisted parody of a man, gray skin stretched over protruding ribs and scapulae, its skull elongated like it had been crushed in a vise. It scrabbled at the glass with cracked, blackened nails, leaving oily smears. I fired the shotgun through the windshield, pulverizing the creature's chest in a burst of glass and gore. To my horror, it continued to writhe and shriek, dark blood oozing from the gaping wound. Its torso pulsed as things pushed out from within the cavity. a repulsive mass of snaking entrails and writhing centipedes. Revulsed, I threw the jeep into reverse, sending the abomination tumbling to the dirt. In the mirror, I watched its ruptured carcass pull itself up with jerky, unnatural movements and lope into the underbrush. I sped away, Evelyn's journal and a singular thought clutched tight. If I couldn't stop these nightmares, the hungry ones would soon spread their corruption beyond the park's borders. An insatiable plague loosed upon the world. Leafing through Evelyn's journal, I began to piece together the dark history buried in this forest. The fur trapper's terrified account was just the start. In the 1920s, a WPA crew building park roads vanished without a trace. Decades later, a Boy Scout troop turned up dead at their campground, mutilated. The wild man sightings continued, a hiker in the 60s raving about a walking shadow that dragged his friend away into the night. The attacks seemed to surge every 30-40 years, when the hungry ones would rise like cicadas to feed, then hibernate, dead but dreaming. Evelyn theorized the entities had a source, a heart of darkness they spawned from. An old mining map showed a strange blank space deep in the park's interior, unlabeled, where she believed a cave system might hide some macabre secrets. But before I could ponder that further, a barrage of muddy thuds and shrieks bombarded the jeep from all sides. Bony silhouettes darted between the roadside pines, moving to cut me off. I gunned the engine, tires spitting dirt and pine needles. In the mirror, dozens of contorted shapes boiled out of the forest behind me, scrambling and bounding in my wake. Their guttural howls turned my stomach to ice. I had to get off the road. It was too easy for them to surround me. I turned down a narrow spur track into the west quarter of the park, bouncing over ruts and sending saplings scraping the undercarriage. My knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel. The trail dead-ended at a ranger watchtower. I leapt from the jeep and scrambled up the rickety stairs. The tower's plywood shelter was barely 4 feet square, a cramped cube with screened window slits on each wall. I barricaded the trapdoor with my pack and extra MRE rations just as the first of the creatures burst from the tree line. They came in a ravenous wave of writhing limbs and gnashing teeth, hurling themselves at the tower's base. It shuddered under their impact. Pallid hands scrabbled at the support posts. Malformed skulls gnashed and clacked, splintering wood. The air filled with their gibbering and my stuttering breath. I emptied my shotgun into the mass, the muzzle flash painting freeze frames of hellish faces and ruptured bodies that refused to die. Claws gouged the floor inches from my feet. I stabbed and kicked, my boots finding spongy flesh and brittle bonework that re-knit before my eyes. The tower's supports splintered. The platform tilted precariously. In desperation, I fired a flare straight up into the night sky. The red trail sizzled heavenward for an eternal instant before bursting into a miniature sun, bathing the canopy crimson and throwing the horde below into stark relief, all jutting ribs and gaping mouths. To my shock, the creatures recoiled from the searing brightness with shrieks of pain, shielding their cavernous eye sockets. They scattered to the shadows, leaving a few withered husks smoldering on the forest floor. Panting, I realized what I'd discovered. The hungry ones feared the light. Perhaps that's why they hibernated in lightless caves for decades between feedings. Fierce hope kindled in my chest, warring with exhaustion. If I could just hold out until dawn. But true night was still hours away, and I had only 3 flares left. The creature's bulbous eyes glinted from the underbrush, patient and ravenous. My gaze fell on the jeep, on its glove box stuffed with crumpled maps. On the Forest Service roads, snaking into the blank space at the heart of the park where no trails went, I knew what I had to do. I had to take the battle to the hungry one's lair, face the source of their evil. It was time for this nightmare to end, one way or another. Evelyn had given her life to find the truth. Now it was up to me to ensure her sacrifice wasn't in vain, and that the world would never fall victim to the hungry dark waiting in these woods. I leapt from the watchtower and sprinted for the jeep, flare gun gripped tight. The hungry ones surged from the shadows in my wake, their grasping claws snatching at my heels. I vaulted into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as a gnarled fist punctured the window, showering me with cubes of safety glass. Shoving the clutch to the floor, I crashed through the creature's ranks, the Jeep's bumpers and fenders crumpling against their desiccated bodies with sickening thuds. In the rearview mirror, I saw them pull their broken forms from the dirt and give chase, mouths agape, dead eyes alight with malice. I sped down the eroded mining track that snaked northeast through the forest, tires spinning on layers of mulched leaves and mud. According to Evelyn's maps, these trails led to a series of abandoned hematite mines from the 1800s, and a cursed cave sacred to the hungry ones. With grim resignation, I knew I had to find their foul grotto and destroy it, or die trying. There could be no other end. The road gradually deteriorated into sluices of scree and sapling scrub. Beyond the Jeep's bloodied headlights, the inky tree line crowded close. Things moved in the roadside bracken, darting shadows in spidery limbs and unblinking eyes. They were pacing me, herding me deeper into their dark heart. The Jeep bounced and shuddered up an incline of muddy ruts. I crested a ridge, and below in the headlight beams sprawled a lost mining settlement reclaimed by the elements. Heaps of rotting timbers, collapsed stone chimneys, rusted machinery upthrust from the soil like the fossils of strange beasts. A few fungal phosphorescents glowed in the chinks and shadows. Nothing human had trod this blighted ground in a century. I stopped the Jeep at the camp's moldering fringe and stepped out into a silence thick as loam. No more howls or rustling in the underbrush, just the whisper of wind through desiccated boughs and the creak of my boots on ancient boards. The hungry ones had withdrawn for now, knowing their quarry could flee no further. With the finality of a tomb door closing, I entered the largest ramshackle structure, perhaps once the mining office. Yellowed documents and frontier detritus littered the floor. Cracked lanterns, rusted pickaxes, scraps of vulcanized rubber. I searched the brittle papers by flickering flashlight, seeking any final scrap of information to guide me. In the rotted desk drawers, I found another leather-bound journal, this one nearly crumbling to the touch. The first page bore a single line in spidery script. Cyrus Blackwood Foreman, Nantahala Iron Mines, 1897. Heart-pounding, I turned the pages with shaking fingers. The final entry spoke of a great evil unearthed by the miners in a cave called Starve Hollow Gulch, of men gone missing in the lightless depths, of a tribal shaman's warnings to seal the tunnels with dynamite, lest the hungry ones wake ravenous from their ancient slumber. But the mining company, seeking profit, had refused. "The mountain bled black this morning," one passage read. Jonas emerged from the mine pale as milk glass, raving about how the shadows moved below, and skittering noises in the dark, and eyes, so many eyes in the void, hungry eyes. I flipped to the last page, my blood turned to ice melt. "The gulch has taken them all. It is too late. God forgive me." A map was tucked into the journal's back cover, sketched in faded pencil on cracked parchment. A twisting line led to a black X scrawled in the hills, an arrow pointing to two dread words, Starve Hollow. No sooner had I grasped this revelation than a bone-chilling howl went up from the forest, echoed by a chorus of others. A flurry of shadows streaked past the broken windows. They knew I'd uncovered their secrets, and now they were coming for me. I burst from the mining office into chaos. The hungry ones boiled out of the night woods, pouring between the skeletal buildings, jerky gait belying their preternatural speed. The closest ones bunched and leapt from the camp's perimeter, mummified faces contorted with glee. I fired a flare into their midst, the harsh magnesium glare throwing back the tide of grasping limbs. An instant before they reached me, smoldering, they shrank from the crimson starbursts, keening. But more were coming, dozens, their malformed silhouettes clogging the gaps between fungus-riddled beams. I sprinted for the Jeep, pulse a war drum in my ears. Glancing at the map, I wrenched the wheel hard toward a gap in the trees, tires spinning on carpet of moldy leaves and wood chips. A steep track, gulched with erosion scars, climbed into the hills northeast, toward the X marking the mine. Broken scenery strobed past the cracked windshield. Deadfalls of hemlock and spruce, banks of massive ferns, jutting outcroppings of dark, glistening stone. Mist threaded the high boughs, obscuring the sickle moon. Spindly shapes scuttled in the rearview mirror's edges, pacing me, yellow eyes like penlights in the gloom. The Jeep bounced and shuddered over ever-worsening terrain. The transmission grinding in my ears mingled with their skittering and rustling behind. My knuckles were bloodless against the steering wheel. There could be no thoughts but to reach the gulch before they overwhelmed me. At last, the track reached a small shelf in the mountain's flank and ended at a head-high hole in a cliff face of obsidian schist, hideously organic in its dimensions, like a petrified maw. A few rotting beams framed the entrance, a cairn of bones heaped to one side. The hungry ones had savaged any creature foolish enough to seek shelter in their den. I pulled to a stop, grabbed my rifle and pack, and leapt from the jeep. The instant my boots hit soil, a tide of howling bodies burst from the trees, charging. I planted my feet, took aim at the closest one, and fired. The slug blew a hole through its skull the size of a rotten apple, but the creature barely slowed, ragdoll arms swinging. I turned to flee into the mine, but the hungry ones were too fast. 3 of them threw themselves on my back, cold fingers sinking into my scalp and neck, ancient nails drawing blood. We fell together across the bone pile in a writhing mass of torn uniforms and leprous flesh. I groped desperately for the flare gun, for a rock, a rusted pickaxe, anything. My hand closed on something rounded, half buried in the bones, ridged like a pine cone. I swung it up in an arc, bashing the creature, trying to gouge out my eyes. There was a brittle crunch and it fell away, black blood gushing from a staved-in temple. In a blink, I realized what I'd grabbed, a human skull, pitted and stained with rich earth. I staggered upright, wielding it like a macabre cudgel. Crazed strength flowed through me, the madness of survival. The hungry ones swarmed, and I laid into them, pulping heads, smashing limb from limb, a savage roar in my throat. But there were too many, an endless stream of horrors. For every one I bludgeoned into the mud, 3 more took its place, lacerating my face and arms, jagged teeth gnashing for an artery. I screamed and kicked and raged, but it was no use. They bore me down, a mass of icy flesh pinning me in the churned soil and bones. Clawed fingers found my throat, my eyes, black spots swimming across my vision, the pulse in my skull a dying ember. This was the end then, the fate of all those I'd failed to save. I would be rendered and devoured, my tattered remnants left to molder at the entrance of their vile gulch, just one more forgotten victim. With my last fading thought, I raised my head and sank my teeth into the fetid wrist, throttling me, biting until I tasted ash and spoiled meat. The creature reared back, screeching, and in that infinitesimal instant of freedom I flung myself toward the mine entrance, a final spasm of defiance. I hit the gravelly floor of the tunnel in a limp roll and scrambled deeper into the inky maw on all fours, gravel and stony shards cutting my palms. Behind me, the hungry ones seethed at the threshold, their luminous eyes and nails floating in the blackness. But they did not follow. Some invisible barrier seemed to hold them at bay, repelling them like matched magnets. They massed there, just outside the shaft, all sinewy arms and distended jaws and eyes, a wall of pale, malevolent stars throbbing with ancient hunger. And then realization crashed through my foggy brain like a tank of icy water. The hungry ones could not enter the mine, not without a human to guide them into the abyss where they were spawned eons ago. That's why they had chased me here, herded me to this nightmarish door. I was to be their key, their vessel to unleash their charnel foulness on the world again. Despair pressed me to the cold stone, heavy as a yoke of iron and just as unyielding. Hot tears spilled down my ravaged cheeks. I couldn't go back, but to go forward into the gullet of their lair was just as sure a death. There had never been any hope of escape. They had been playing me for a fool this entire time. In the distance behind the seething horror at the mouth of the tunnel, a gray pre-dawn glow limned the mist-shrouded treetops. The night was ending, but my long final night was just beginning. There was nowhere to go but down into the black heart of the mountain to face the progenitor of all my battles and fears. I stood on quaking legs, drawing my last threads of courage around me like a tattered cloak. The hungry ones crouched in the tunnel mouth, a phalanx of shadowed limbs and teeth and unholy anticipation, waiting for me to lead them into the primordial womb that had disgorged them upon the world again and again over the eons, waiting for access to their queen. With leaden feet, rifle clutched before me like an amulet. I started into the mine's black gullet, flare gun a comforting weight against my hip. The tunnel's strange geology swallowed the pre-dawn light after a dozen paces, and I clicked on my flashlight. The bobbing orb illuminated close-pressing walls of rippled obsidian, glinting like black ice. Behind me, I heard the hungry ones surge forward into the shaft, their long-denied homecoming a tide of scraping claws and gnashing teeth and guttural snarls. They dogged my stumbling steps, pacing me, cruel eyes boring into my back with palpable weight. One reached out to stroke my neck with a palsied hand, glee and hunger pulsing in its caress. The tunnel wound down in serpentine coils, the floor alternately natural shale and rotted wooden slats. A foul miasma hung in the air, ripe with the musk of centuries' undisturbed loam and ancient decay. The walls grew damp, beaded with an oily sheen. Puddles in the uneven floor held floating clouds of luminescent spores, eldritch will-o'-wisps. Time lost all meaning in that abyssal maw. I wandered in the press of dripping stone and Venus roots and grasping fungal blooms for an eternity, each bend in the passage revealing only more of the same black nightmare. The skittering of my unnatural entourage receded to a background drone, though I could feel the heat of their covetous gazes. At last, the tunnel opened into a vast sunken vault, the space shot through with curtains of phosphorescent mushrooms and ropes of calcite. A few rotting wooden structures dotted the cavern's edges, collapsed lift scaffolds, a few stacks of crumbling barrels, and at the chamber's nadir, a roiling black lake, its surface pocked with skeletal shapes. I crept to the edge of the subterranean mirror and shone my light into the icy depths. Suspended in the peaty water like macabre ornaments were dozens of human remains in varying states of decay. The missing hikers, my fellow rangers, their open mouths frozen in eternal screams. As I watched, a few sank into the black murk, while others rose as if on puppet strings to take their place. And I knew then the terrible truth. This was how the hungry ones replenished their ranks after each cyclical culling. The icy waters preserved their fleshy shells, while the pit of roots, as the tribal legends called it, nourished the evil animating them from below. A self-sustaining colony of darkness defiling the land's forgotten corner. As the revelation crashed over me, I felt my strength give out at last. I couldn't fight this. Couldn't overcome a malignance that had festered in the depths for untold centuries before humanity's first footprints in the loam. All my efforts had been futile. Evil would always grow again in the cracks, the shadows, the blind spaces beneath the world. I sank to my knees at the pit's edge, watching the bobbing husks of those I had failed. The hungry ones fanned out around me, a susurrating, gleeful mass, waiting for me to surrender myself to the black water, to join my friends in their numb, blind servitude, waiting to be loosed upon the world in a dark tide by the lifting of the last human obstacle. In my despair, my gaze fell on the rotting timbers at the cavern's fringe, and Evelyn's final words echoed in my exhausted brain. The shaman urged us to seal the tunnels with dynamite lest they wake ravenous. And like a lightning strike, desperate purpose galvanized my nerves, sent power surging back into my drained limbs. Seal the tunnels. I still had one card left to play, a final sheaf to lay upon this dark altar. I lunged for the nearest stack of decaying barrels, the hungry ones scattering in surprise. A few bore faded labels in archaic script. Danger, explosives. Weeping with mad hope, I ripped the cap from my flare gun and rammed the phosphorus tip into the wood's soft rot, crimson flame blooming. As the conflagration spread, I dashed to the next stack and repeated the process, trails of sparks chasing me. The creatures howled in rage and consternation, their unified purpose shattering. Some surged for me in a chittering wave, while others milled in confusion. I ran along the pit's perimeter, touching the torch to every moldy crate and barrel, darting from gnarled hands and snapping teeth. Flames billowed and coiled through the chamber, sucking the oxygen to a stifling miasma. At last I turned and sprinted back up the mine shaft, the inferno roaring behind me, the acrid bite of ancient chemicals filling my lungs. The hungry ones shrieked and gibbered in my wake, engulfed in clouds of spitting embers. I felt claws snag my shirt, my hair, but I pushed on. The promise of the nearing dawn, a siren song. I burst from the tunnel mouth into the gray forest a moment before the world ended. With an earth-shattering roar, the mountain bucked and heaved, fire and smoke erupting from the high crags. The cliffs crumpled inward like rotted cloth, burying the accursed gulch beneath 1,000,000 tons of rubble. Trees snapped and were hurled like javelins, and I was flung a dozen yards by the blast wave into a cushion of fern and humus. For a long moment, I lay stunned on my back, watching ashes and embers spiral across the pre-dawn sky like macabre snow. The echoes of the explosion rang in my bruised skull. Slowly, shakily, I sat up, marveling at my survival. For a long moment I lay stunned on my back, watching ashes and embers spiral across the pre-dawn sky like macabre snow. The echoes of the explosion rang in my bruised skull. Slowly, shakily, I sat up, marveling at my survival. The hungry ones were gone, consumed by the cave-in, or banished back to whatever primordial maw had first belched them upon the world. The land's wound would scab over and heal, its fell secrets buried deep, and eventually fade into half-remembered ghost stories once again. But I would never forget. I would carry the scars, inside and out, for the rest of my days. I limped through the hushed forest, stepping over shattered trunks and smoldering craters, as the first fingers of dawn pried at the horizon. Overhead, a raven flew silently between the branches, regarding me with ebon eyes that held no hunger, no malice, just simple animal wisdom, nature's order restored. At last I emerged from the trees near the abandoned mining camp. Mist wreathed the fungus-riddled ruins, stirring with motes of ash. The air felt preternaturally still, cleansed, like after a thunderstorm. In the distance I spotted my battered jeep, still miraculously upright on the overgrown track. I clambered inside, fumbling for the radio. Static hissed from the speakers for a long, terrifying moment. Then a voice crackled to life, high and tense with worry, but achingly human. Nantahala Ranger Station to all field units, come in. Repeat, Ranger Station to Alex Walker. Please respond. Over. I shut my eyes and exhaled a shuddering breath I felt like I'd been holding for days. They must have seen the explosion, must be sending rescue choppers even now. It was over. I was going home. I pressed the talk button, fighting back tears. Ranger Walker to base, I read you. Over. Alex, thank God. What's your 20? Are you all right? Over. I looked out through the cracked windshield at the brightening forest, battered but calm, tranquil. The marks of its battles would fade with time, even as mine never would. But for now there was peace. The hungry ones were gone. I had won. Affirmative base, I said, shook up but intact. I'm at the old trailhead off Laurel Ridge Road. I've got quite a story to tell you, and a warning. Roger that, Alex. You can tell us everything soon. Bird is spinning up now. ETA, your position 15 minutes. Just sit tight. You're going to be okay. Over. Copy, base, sitting tight. Walker out. I set the radio down with numb fingers and leaned back against the headrest. The sun broke over the mountainside, washing the woods in gold. I closed my eyes and let its warmth play across my battered face. There would be debriefings, reports, endless questions I had no sane answers for. There would be nightmares, scars, and the knowledge that true evil lurked in the forgotten spaces of the world. But for now, I let myself drift in the light. I had done my duty. I had given everything. And I had won. I had faced the hungry dark and lived to see the dawn. The dense Oregon forest closed in around me as I hiked deeper into the wilderness, following the faint trail on my GPS. When I applied for this secret government job, I never imagined it would bring me to the remote corners of the country, facing unknown dangers. But the steady paycheck was too tempting to pass up given my mounting debts and financial struggles back home in city. I thought back to the strange briefing before this mission. My superiors spoke in ominous tones about the disappearances that plagued these woods, local residents and hikers vanishing without a trace over the decades. The reports were eerily similar to old native folklore about people being led astray by malevolent forest spirits, never to be seen again. As a rational person, I chalk the stories up to natural causes like animal attacks or people simply getting lost. Still, an inexplicable sense of dread settled over me as I ventured further from civilization. The sun dipped below the treetops, and I quickened my pace, eager to make camp before nightfall. In the fading light, I spotted a weathered sign nailed to a tree. "Turn back." The hairs on my neck stood up. Probably just paranoid locals, I told myself, pushing ahead until I reached the coordinates I'd been given. I set up my small tent and built a fire, but dark shadows danced at the edges of the flickering light. Whispered voices carried on the wind, or maybe it was just my imagination. Fatigue from the long trek finally overpowered my nerves, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I awoke with a start, but it took a moment to figure out why. Then I heard it again, a blood-curdling scream in the distance. I grabbed my pistol and flashlight and cautiously peered out of the tent. Scanning the surrounding forest, I saw nothing but the dim flicker of my dying campfire. The scream echoed through the woods again, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. Every instinct told me to run, but I had a job to do. With a deep breath, I chambered around and stepped out to face the horrors that lurked in the shadows. I barely slept after the terrifying sounds in the night. At first light, I broke camp, wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was out there. Trusting my GPS, I hiked deeper into the uncharted forest. As a Marine lieutenant, I was trained for combat. But this felt different. Fighting insurgents in the Middle East, the enemy was clear. Out here, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The forest had an oppressive atmosphere, like something ancient and evil permeated the very soil underfoot. I thought back to the old native legends, and a chill ran down my spine. Still, I had to stay focused on the mission. 5 locals had gone missing in this area over the past month. The secret task force I worked for, known only as Unit 13, was called in to investigate when the disappearances defied explanation. Publicly, the government denied our existence, but behind the scenes, we handled the cases too strange and disturbing for normal law enforcement. I came to a ravine slicing through the forest floor, with a fraying rope bridge spanning the gap. On the far side, a glint of color caught my eye. I crossed the bridge, ignoring the creaking wood and swaying under my feet. There, snagged on a bush, was a torn shred of bright blue fabric, the same color worn by one of the missing hikers. My heart raced as I bagged the potential evidence. I was scanning the area for other clues when I heard the snap of a branch behind me. I whirled around, my gun aimed at nothing. Then I noticed the footprint in the mud, far too large to be human. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I grabbed the trunk of a nearby tree to steady myself. Something was very wrong with this forest. I thought of the missing people and knew I was their only hope of being found. Taking a deep breath, I collected myself and moved deeper into the woods. The day grew darker as storm clouds gathered overhead. The thick canopy blocked what little light penetrated the ominous sky. Even with my flashlight, I could barely see the faint trail winding through the dense undergrowth. Without warning, the heavens opened up. Rain pounded the leaves and thunder rumbled in the distance. Soaked to the bone, I spotted the entrance to a small cave and ducked inside, relieved to be out of the deluge. As I caught my breath, my eyes adjusted to the gloom. The cave walls were carved with primitive drawings, human figures contorted in agony as they were attacked by huge, twisted creatures. An involuntary shudder ran through me as I wondered if the drawings were the product of some ancient nightmare or based on a horrifying reality. I pulled out my satellite phone, hoping to update HQ on my progress, but the device displayed an error message. No signal. Of course, I was on my own out here. Suddenly, heavy footsteps sounded at the mouth of the cave, coming closer. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, pistol aimed at the entrance with shaking hands. A hulking silhouette filled the opening, then stepped into the dim light. It was a bear, the largest I'd ever seen. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over me, and let out a deafening roar that reverberated off the stone walls. I pulled the trigger, and a deafening shot rang out. The bear staggered, then dropped to the ground with a massive thud. My ears rang in the silence that followed. I prodded the unmoving bear with my boot, amazed that a single shot had taken down such a beast. Then, as I examined the carcass, my blood turned to ice. The bear's fur was matted with sticky, coagulated blood. It had already been dead before it attacked. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran headlong into the storm, desperate to escape the cave. Lightning flashed as I fled back to the narrow trail, but my mind reeled, trying to comprehend what I'd just witnessed. What ungodly power could reanimate a dead creature? I thought of the ancient drawings, and a terrifying certainty gripped me. There was something in these woods far more dangerous than any bear. The rain finally slowed to a drizzle as night fell. I'd made camp near a rocky outcropping that provided some shelter from the elements and any nocturnal predators. With the adrenaline from my encounter with the undead bear still coursing through me, I doubted I'd be able to sleep. I pulled out my waterproof notebook and flipped through the missing persons files, searching for any detail I might have overlooked. The most recent disappearance had been a week ago, a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn Carver. She had been out foraging for mushrooms when she vanished. Search parties had found no trace of her. As I studied Evelyn's photo, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the dim glow of my fire. I grabbed my pistol, wondering if another possessed animal had picked up my scent. I strained my ears but heard nothing else. Still, the feeling of being watched made the hair on my neck stand up. Unable to shake the sense of impending danger, I kicked dirt over the fire, plunging my camp into darkness. I crouched behind the rocks with my gun and flashlight ready. An eternity seemed to pass. Then rustling came from the bushes across the clearing. I flipped on my flashlight and nearly screamed. In the stark beam of light was a face, or what was left of one. Gray, mottled flesh sagged off the skull. Worms writhed in the empty eye sockets. Worst of all, shreds of bright blue fabric hung off the desiccated body. It was the missing hiker whose torn clothing I'd found caught on the bush earlier that day. He shambled into the clearing, dragging a decomposing leg behind him at an unnatural angle. The corpse opened its mouth, and a hissing breath wheezed out from the hole where its throat had rotted away. My mind reeled as I tried to process the horror before me. This was no natural creature of the forest, reanimated by a lightning strike like the bear. The hiker had been dead far too long. His fatal wounds, the slashes across his neck and chest, were clearly from no animal. Something had ripped him apart. And now he'd returned as a monstrous revenant. I aimed my pistol at the abomination with trembling hands, then squeezed the trigger. The bullet tore through the forehead with a sickening crunch. The creature crumpled to the forest floor. I stared in shock at the motionless heap of necrotic flesh and bone. I'd seen combat, witnessed death up close, but nothing could have prepared me for this. I glanced again at Evelyn's photo, a dizzying realization taking hold. If the missing hiker had been transformed into a murderous wraith, had the others suffered the same grisly fate? Were they still out there, roaming the woods, thirsting for innocent blood? Icy sweat dripped down my back despite the chill in the air. I had to warn the other search parties combing the forest for the lost. But would they believe me? Or would they think I'd gone mad? After all, Unit 13 specialized in cases that defied rational explanation. I was trained to deal with the paranormal, the things that go bump in the night. But this was something else entirely, and I had a sinking feeling I'd just stumbled into an evil far more ancient and powerful than anything I'd ever known. Morning brought no relief from the nightmare I'd found myself in. Fog as thick as soup blanketed the forest floor. Several times I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, but could never spot the source when I turned to look. Still, the eerie feeling of being watched never left me. I radioed HQ to apprise them of the situation, doing my best to downplay the supernatural horrors. The last thing I needed was for my bosses to declare me unfit for duty and pull me out, abandoning the lost souls still trapped in this accursed place. I requested backup, But command said it would take 48 hours to get another team to my location. I had to survive 2 more nights alone in this hellscape. I forced myself to hike on, despite my near-paralyzing dread. Each missing person might still be out there, their corrupted forms posing a danger to innocent hikers and locals. I had to find them before they could do more harm. I pulled out my GPS tracker, but it kept glitching, the screen flickering as if possessed by an evil spirit. The needle of the magnetic compass spun erratically, refusing to hold a fixed bearing. I resorted to tracking the sun across the sky to orient myself. Pushing through a tangle of underbrush, I found myself at the edge of a large clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its trunk twisted with age. Thick roots bulged up from the forest floor like the limbs of some malformed creature. And in the shadows between them, I glimpsed the corner of a backpack, the same color Evelyn Carver was last seen carrying. I approached the gnarled tree slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The backpack was wedged between 2 massive roots. I pulled it free, noting the dark stain splattering the outside. With shaking hands, I unzipped it and removed the contents. A wallet with Evelyn's driver's license, trail maps of the area, one of which was speckled with drops of what looked like dried blood. And at the very bottom, a journal. I opened the first page and recognized Evelyn's neat script. She wrote about a strange fog that had enveloped her while she was out mushroom hunting. She became hopelessly disoriented and walked in circles for hours, despite being an experienced outdoorswoman. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. "It's the fog," she had scrawled in jagged, desperate letters. "It's alive. It wants to consume me. I'm sorry, John. I should have believed you." I flipped back to the first entry about the fog. The word John caught my eye, and suddenly I knew exactly who Evelyn was. John Carver, a retired ranger living near the forest, had vanished 4 years ago. His disappearance had gone unsolved. Until now. Thunder rumbled overhead as the pieces clicked into place. What if all the missing over the years hadn't gotten lost or fallen victim to wild animals? What if something far more sinister had befallen them? Something that lurked in the fog-shrouded heart of the forest, hungering for human essence? I recalled the research I'd done before setting out, the old native legends that warned of an immortal evil dwelling deep in the woods, monstrous creatures that could take human form to lure their prey into the fog, where they transformed them into undead abominations, cursed to join their ranks for all eternity. The legends were true, and now Evelyn and the others were part of that hellish realm. I had to get out of here. I had to warn everyone. But as I turned to flee, an icy wall of fog began rolling into the clearing, far too fast to be natural. It surrounded the twisted tree, cutting off my escape. As the mist engulfed me, I felt a paralyzing cold seep into my veins. The gun fell from my frozen fingers as I fought to remain conscious. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was a figure emerging from the fog. At first it looked human. Then I saw its face, the rotting visage of Evelyn Carver. I jolted awake in pitch darkness, my heart jackhammering against my ribs. It took a moment to remember where I was and how I'd gotten here. The fog. Evelyn's reanimated corpse. Then nothing. I fumbled for my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam danced over jagged rock walls. I was inside some kind of natural stone chamber. Roots and tendrils snaked through cracks in the ceiling high above. I must be underground, in a cave system that riddled the mountain like a honeycomb. I replayed my last memory, trying to make sense of what happened. The hypnotic fog had trapped me, and then I swore I'd seen Evelyn's lifeless body shuffling toward me. But that was impossible. My oxygen-starved brain must have conjured the nightmarish vision before I passed out. I'd probably stumbled into the cave entrance in my delirium and collapsed. Staggering to my feet, I checked myself over. Other than some new bruises and a pounding headache, I seemed intact. But my relief evaporated when I spotted the camera mounted on my tactical vest. The blinking red light indicated it was recording. With trembling fingers, I hit playback on the small digital screen and watched the footage of my trek through the woods. The video showed me setting up camp the previous night. Fast forwarding, I watched myself doze off. An hour ticked by on the timestamp. Then my blood ran cold. In the eerie green glow of the night vision, a thick mist seeped into my camp, snaking around my sleeping bag like a living thing. The fog condensed into humanoid shapes, their forms shifting and writhing in unnatural contortions. They gathered around my prone body, skeletal arms outstretched. I must have cried out because the figures snapped their heads toward the camera in perfect unison. Glowing eyes flashed in the darkness. Lipless mouths opened in silent snarls, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The horrors closed in on me, their grasping hands inches from my face. Then the screen went black. I resisted the urge to hurl the camera across the cave. Collapsing against the stone wall, I fought to control my ragged breathing. Those creatures had been real. They'd taken me, which meant I hadn't wandered into this cave. Something had dragged me here. On cue, a guttural moan echoed through the tunnels, raising every hair on my neck. I snatched up my flashlight and pistol. The pack with my satellite phone and extra ammo was gone. The monsters must have disposed of it to prevent me from calling for help. I considered my options. I could hunker down and hope my team would reach me in time. But I had a feeling the creature's den was not a place I wanted to remain for long. The moaning grew louder, joined by shuffling footsteps and the scraping of something sharp against stone. I made my choice. Steeling myself, I crept toward the tunnel at the far end of the chamber, straining to remember my army training on navigating subterranean passageways. Time to find a way out of this underworld, or die trying. The narrow stone passageway twisted and turned, disorienting me until I lost all sense of direction. I might have been wandering for minutes or hours. Time lost all meaning in the perpetual gloom of the tunnel, broken only by the meager beam of my flashlight. The air grew colder and danker the deeper I ventured. A vague sense of wrongness pervaded the tunnels, as if I'd crossed a threshold into a place where the laws of nature held no sway. I was debating turning back when the passage opened into a vast cavern. I stepped into the enormous cavern, my flashlight barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. The beam played over towering stone formations that rose from the ground like the twisted claws of some gigantic subterranean beast. I had the unnerving sense that I'd entered the monster's lair. Shadows danced at the edges of my light, and I caught flickers of movement in my peripheral vision. But when I whipped the flashlight around, I found only bare rock. Was my fear-addled mind playing tricks, conjuring phantoms in the dark? Or were those shadow things all too real, like the shambling horrors that had dragged me into this abyss? I pulled out my water canteen and took a swig to calm my nerves. But the liquid burned my throat, and I doubled over, gagging. A sickly sweet scent filled my nostrils. In my haste to escape the creature's den, I must have grabbed the wrong container, the one where I stored the kerosene for my camp stove. I flung the canteen away in disgust, and it clattered across the stone, the sound echoing through the cavern. Hissing whispers erupted in the darkness, like a pit of vipers disturbed from slumber. I froze, my heart pounding a staccato beat. Silence fell, so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. The air crackled with tension, like the breath before a scream. Slowly I panned my flashlight across the cavern. The beam fell upon a crevice in the far wall, and my breath caught in my throat. Something was wedged into the gap in the rock, something that gleamed white in the darkness. I crept closer, dread building in my gut with every step. As I drew near, the object resolved into an unmistakable and horrifying shape, a human skull. Other bones were piled beneath the skull, along with the tattered remains of clothing. The beam of my flashlight glinted off an REI logo on the torn backpack strap tangled around a femur. My knees buckled, and I fought down the urge to vomit as I realized what I was looking at, the remains of the missing hikers. They'd been dragged here, just like me, to meet a grisly end as dinner for the insatiable monsters lurking in the darkness. I stumbled back from the grim tableau, my mind reeling. How many innocent souls lay scattered in this dark lair, their final screams echoing unheard through these tunnels? Would I end up just another pile of gnawed bones for the next poor bastard to find? Bile burned the back of my throat, along with the bitter taste of despair. I was outmatched here, a lone soldier with a pistol and a few bullets against an unspeakable horde of horrors straight out of humankind's most primal nightmares. What could one man do against such reckless hate? But then I thought of the missing townsfolk, of Evelyn Carver and her husband John, doomed to wander this netherworld through no fault of their own. If I gave up now, there would be no one left to tell their story, to warn others of the ancient evil that haunted these woods. Taking a shuddering breath, I turned back the way I'd come, my resolve hardening. Hopeless as it seemed, I had to find a way to escape this dank labyrinth, to fight my way back to the surface and the land of the living. I owed it to the dead to survive, to make sure their fates were not forgotten. Shadows writhed hungrily in the cavern behind me as I fled back into the winding tunnels. The whispering grew louder, joined by deranged giggles and inhuman snarls. They knew fresh meat was on the menu tonight. Let them come. If I had to go down fighting, I'd make damn sure I took some of those monsters with me into oblivion. I ran until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed for mercy. But no matter how many twists and turns I took, the tunnels all looked the same, dragging me deeper into an inescapable stone maze. Despair clawed at my mind as I dropped to my knees in exhaustion. The demonic cackling echoed from every direction now, drawing inexorably closer. I wondered if this was how all the other victims had felt in their final moments, lost, alone, hunted by nightmares made flesh. I thought of my little sister back home, of game nights playing video game, and weekends exploring favorite hiking spot. I'd gotten into this line of work to make enough money to support her after Mom passed. She'd be all alone in the world now. Tears blurred my vision, and I angrily wiped them away. No, I refused to die sniveling in the dark like a lost child. If I was going out, I'd face it like a soldier, on my feet, with my head held high. I leaned on the stone wall as I slowly stood, but instead of hard rock, my hand pressed into empty air. I stumbled through the seemingly solid stone into a small side chamber, as if the wall had been nothing more than a curtain of shadow. Before me stood a familiar sight, the ancient tree stump from the clearing, its roots spreading across the chamber floor, and slumped against the twisted trunk was a figure cloaked in shimmering mist. I approached slowly, my pistol aimed center mass. "Evelyn?" I breathed. "Evelyn Carver?" The figure lifted its head, glowing eyes piercing the fog. When it spoke, the voice was feminine but layered with otherworldly echoes. "Evelyn is gone," it said, "consumed, like all the others. Only I remain." The mist fell away, revealing the specter's face. I recoiled in horror and revulsion. It was Evelyn, and yet not. Her once kind features were twisted in an expression of inhuman cruelty and hunger. Her skin looked as ancient as the tree she leaned against, ridged with bark-like scars. "What are you?" I managed to choke out. The creature that had been Evelyn rose to its feet, its movements serpentine and unnatural. "The forest spirits had many names to your kind once. Hide behind, Wendigo, the hungry ones." It prowled toward me slowly, a predator savoring its prey's terror. "Your modern world has forgotten the old ways, the blood rituals that kept my kind banished to shadow. But we remember. We've been waiting, gathering our power to rise again." I aimed my gun at the monster's heart, though my hands shook. "And the missing people?" The thing smiled, exposing brown, needle-like teeth. "The fog is my doorway. I called to them, drew them to my domain to make them part of me, to help me grow stronger." It lunged at me with blinding speed. I squeezed the trigger. The gunshot boomed in the enclosed chamber. But the bullet passed right through the specter, shattering a stalactite behind it. The monster cackled. "Foolish meat thing. No mortal weapon can harm me." It slammed into me with the force of a truck, sending my gun flying. Impossibly strong fingers closed around my throat as it pinned me to the chamber wall. I struggled against its grip, but it was like fighting an oak tree. The monster leaned close, its fetid breath washing over me. Mist began to seep from its mouth, probing toward my nostrils and lips. "Don't fight it," it crooned. "Give in to the fog. Let me in. Let me taste your essence. Soon you'll be part of me too, wandering this realm for all time." The deadly fog pushed into my mouth and nose, filling my lungs with icy cold. I convulsed, feeling it invade my body on a cellular level, leaching away my life force as it converted flesh to mist. As my vision dimmed, my flailing hand brushed the ancient tree stump. A desperate idea ignited in my oxygen-starved brain. I groped until my fingers closed around a thick, sharp shard of wood. With a soundless scream of defiance, I plunged the jagged wooden stake into the monster's chest. The creature howled in unbridled agony and rage, dropping me as it staggered back. The stake protruded from its torso, black ooze spreading across its shirt. "You dare? I am the Forest Eternal. I cannot be destroyed." But cracks were already racing across its bark-like skin. The specter crumbled like charcoal, dissolving into mist that was sucked back into the shard of ancient wood like smoke drawn into a vacuum. And then, silence. It was over, as quickly as it began. The only evidence of the creature's existence was the stake and the pile of ash slowly dissipating on the stone floor. I collapsed beside the remains of the tree, my chest heaving as I gulped down air. My head spun with the revelation of what I'd just witnessed and defeated. The monster had been inextricably linked to this ancient oak, a seed of corruption dwelling in its heartwood for untold centuries, inextricably linked to its life force. The legends had been true. Only wood from the source could banish a forest demon back to its realm. I thought of Evelyn, John, and all the other innocent souls transformed and consumed by that timeless evil. In the end, they'd unwittingly given me the key to their salvation by leading me here, to the center of the monster's dark power. I know this sounds crazy. Hell, if someone had told me this story a week ago, I'd have urged them to up their meds. But I swear on my life that every word is true. There are things lurking in the shadows of our world, horrors from the darkest depths of myth and legend that defy explanation. Monsters that view humanity as cattle, ours to be bled dry by their insatiable hunger. But now I know our myths also hold the key to fighting back, to banishing these nightmares back to the abyss. I called HQ and told them I'd solved the case, that the missing were lost and presumed dead. I didn't dare share the full story, even with my superiors. They'd lock me in a padded room, pump me full of drugs until drool replaced the horrors lurking behind my eyes. No, the burden of this truth would be mine to bear alone. But also the quest to unearth more secrets, more half-forgotten lore on how to combat these ancient evils. I owe it to the victims who saved my life to become humanity's sentinel against the darkness. That is why I'm sharing my story with you now. Because if the legends are awakening, we'll need every mind and every ally in the battles to come. Together, through knowledge and conviction, we can light the shadows and safeguard our world from the hungry ones. It's time to remember what our ancestors knew. Because the monsters never truly died. They've just been sleeping, waiting for us to believe in them once again.